Good evening and welcome to The Proof is Out There. More than 2 decades ago, Navy aviators from the USS Nimitz encountered this UFO about 100 miles off the coast of California. That video was shot from the left wing camera of an FA-18 Super Hornet. And the pilots who saw it up close say it looked like a giant tic-tac, a smooth, white, wingless object that traversed both air and water and outperformed their own aircraft. It produced years of speculation, even government hearings, and now another tic-tac video has emerged. It is just past 7 p.m. on February 15th, 2023, and the Navy's USS Jackson combat ship is just off the coast of San Diego, California, not far from the site of the 2004 tic-tac encounter in a special use airspace area known as W-291.
An operations specialist on board the ship, Alexandro Wiggins, observed something unusual on radar, and he took to the deck to make an observation with the naked eye, and he witnessed some kind of structure or light emanating up from the waterline.
Watching this light emerge from the water at a distance and then go into the air with a solid light, no blinking or anything, I've never witnessed that ever in my life.
Wiggins went back inside the control room to check his radar screen, where he and other sailors witnessed 4 objects, at which point they began recording with the Sci-Fi system.
The Sapphire, an infrared sensor that detects heat, focuses on 2 of the objects flying from right to left in perfect synchronicity. The monitor punches in on one of the objects, revealing the familiar tic-tac shape, apparently hovering over the ocean. Moments after the video ends, Senior Chief Wiggins says the watch team zooms out on the monitor just in time to see all 4 objects shoot off simultaneously. Though odd, the objects show no hostile intent, so it goes unreported until April 2025, when investigative journalist Jeremy Corbell gets a hold of the video and releases it to massive media coverage.
The video just caused astonishment because these things have been a repeat presence in those waters, including the original Tic Tac video, and Jeremy Corbell also released the USS Omaha video, which captured one of these objects splashing down.
What was splashed?
In fact, original reporting on the History Channel series Unidentified Inside America's UFO Investigation revealed that the 2004 Tic Tac was even seen on sonar.
Sonar said they got a hit. According to one of the sonar guys, they were going 70+ knots under the water.
We've known that the Navy has been dealing with these USOs now for decades. In fact, there's some reporting that's come out where you actually have whistleblowers from the U.S. Navy coming out and talking about some of their experiences, most notably the USS Hampton that was in the late 1990s during an operation, had detected something moving very, very fast. And some of the individuals actually on that submarine who detected this estimated the speed was faster than the speed of sound.
The location of that incident has not been disclosed. But are these repeated incidents, all in the same area, evidence of something greater than just a few flying objects?
These are all just theories, but one that makes the rounds among naval personnel is the potential existence of an underwater base from which these objects emerge and return to. It's, of course, just a speculative hypothesis, but these objects have been variously recorded or witnessed emerging from the waters off the coast of San Diego. The collective details are just extraordinary.
This new Tic Tac video hasn't just wowed the American public. It was even shared with Navy aviator David Fravor, who encountered the first Tic Tac back in 2004. He said he was stunned by the similarities. Let's see if our experts have the same reaction. This was February 2023, just days after a Chinese spy balloon crossed America, setting the nation on edge and ultimately leading to a shoot-down just off the East Coast. Could these be intelligence-gathering inflatables?
I took a look at the weather on that day, and you had winds from the west at about 6 miles an hour. So if they were balloons, you would see the balloons going with the wind in one direction, and it doesn't do that.
That still doesn't rule out a foreign incursion, though. We know drones have been an issue over military bases and U.S. soil, and the suspicion is that they are the work of adversarial nations. Is this video proof they might be toying with our Navy, too?
I will point out that the motions you see could be done by drones, including the synchronicity, but you also have a situation where these people described it as being that they instantaneously shot off. And they were talking about a really, really incredibly fast speed. And so that doesn't sound like a drone.
Since this is special use airspace, could these be special aircraft, perhaps part of a secret military test?
Could they be doing a test that the Jackson wasn't aware of? Yeah, maybe. We have the signal transmedium type thing. Submarine launched ballistic missiles do that. But if it was a missile, it'd be moving fast. And that size of that object would get smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller until it was gone. Right? That would have happened very quickly. And in this case, it didn't go away.
With those possibilities eliminated, the question becomes, were these UFOs?
Well, I believe that they saw the tic-tac because you had a very clear observation by a witness visibly that it was being picked up on radar, was also being picked up in this thermal imaging system. All those things combined put it into a very strong case of being an unknown.
Our verdict? Genuine UFOs. Remember, even though the video mostly focused on one tic-tac, all four of these things were seen shooting off almost instantaneously, making them all unidentified flying objects. The release of these tic-tac videos could be having an impact. Recently, the U.S. National Archives opened the floodgates on decades worth of UFO documentation. Believe it or not, cattle are amazing creatures. They have nearly 360-degree vision and can smell odors up to 6 miles away. Are they interesting enough for aliens to study? This video might be the proof. May 2020. It's a quiet night in a barn on a rural farm, exact location unknown. A herd of cattle is standing peacefully in their pens, but around 11 p.m., the motion-activated camera captures something extraordinary. A fully grown bull comes bursting in through the ceiling. Miraculously, the bull appears unharmed. Now watch, as the bull struggles, a strange bright orb floats across the screen from right to left. After a few seconds, the bull manages to lift himself off the stanchion and walk away as if nothing happened. An anonymous poster soon uploads the video online, where it immediately begins garnering hits.
This video kind of ties into the classic story of cows being beamed up onto spacecraft, studied and analyzed, and then dropped back down into their pasture. Some UFO believers say the glowing orb crossing in front of the camera is all evidence that this cow was just returned from a UFO.
But where does that idea come from? The answer is darker than you might expect.
The idea of cow abduction by UFO really started after a wave of cattle mutilations in the mid-1970s. Farmers were finding their cows dead in their fields, but curiously, their eyes, ears, genitals, and tongues, among other organs, had been removed, and with such surgical precision, it almost looked like it was done by an intelligent species. Some farmers claimed to have seen lights in the sky over the site before they found their cows mutilated.
This bull is still, thankfully, intact, but incidents like this are strikingly common.
There are are, strangely, many stories of cows falling from the sky. In November of 2007, near Lake Chelan, Washington, a 600-pound cow fell off a mountain and landed on the roof of a minivan of a couple just trying to celebrate their first wedding anniversary.
Holy cow! This video is intense. But seriously, it is hard to imagine any animal surviving such a fall. Is it possible this creature had a late-night date with a UFO? Let's move on to our experts for analysis. Okay, no more cow puns. Some online speculate this bull could have been thrown by a violent storm. But is there any evidence of that?
There have been known instances of tornadoes picking up livestock, but when we look at the video, there's nothing that leads me to believe that the wind is strong. The debris that we see immediately after the cow falls vertically. There is no horizontal movement.
So could this bull have truly fallen from a UFO?
If a cow fell a great distance from a craft, like hundreds or thousands of feet, it for sure would not survive. It would die on impact. Even if it's not from that large of a distance, they're not great at withstanding falls due to their body structure.
With its stocky, compact body, a cow can't distribute the weight of a fall the way, say, a tiger could. The entire force instead concentrates on its fragile legs. A fall over 20 feet would injure a cow, and 40 feet would probably kill it. It's likely this bull didn't fall more than 10 feet, which is an important clue.
If we go back to the start of the video, go by one frame at a time, something you notice is that this portion of the roof here is actually starting to bend, which indicates to me that it's not the cow hitting the roof. It would indicate to me that the cow is already on the roof and the roof is just starting to give way.
And the orb in the background? That's likely just the flashlight of a worried farmer checking on his livestock after spotting the bull on the roof. But what was it doing up there in the first place?
What may have happened is that part of the roof was low enough to the ground that the cow could climb on it, or perhaps it was close to a hillside and the cow could get on the roof by climbing onto the hill first. But a cow, just like a lot of other animals, is probably just curious, and why not go on the roof?
Our verdict? Roof collapse. We don't know whether or not other cows have had secret liaisons with extraterrestrials, but the idea that this guy was abducted by aliens is just a bunch of bull. Seeing the Aurora Borealis, or the Northern Lights, is certainly on my bucket list, and Canada is a great place for it. In certain parts of the country, they appear up to 300 nights a year. But one Canadian family says they recently saw something just as amazing and a lot more unexpected. May 10th, 2024. It's between 10 and 11 p.m. in Kelowna, British Columbia. Bobby Vandenhorn and his family are gathered on his rooftop patio, hoping to catch a glimpse of the Aurora Borealis.
The Aurora Borealis is a beautiful natural phenomenon. Essentially, as the sun is giving off solar energy, it's flying through space and it slams into the Earth's atmosphere. All of those charged particles interact with the various molecules that make up Earth's atmosphere and burn up into light. And we get this spectacular, beautiful light show as a result.
But as the Vandenhorn family waits for the lights to appear overhead, something else catches their attention.
What is that?
Bobby records a cluster of 5 bright white orbs twinkling in the distance.
Oh, and now they're bunching all together? Oh my goodness.
And that's just the start. As the night goes on, Bobby takes several more videos of strange light formations, and he says the footage doesn't capture the half of it.
I probably saw about 20 plus groups of those orbs, and each group had anywhere from 2 to 3 all the way up to 25 to 30 of them.
Bobby posts the video online and even submits it to the local news, where it draws thousands of eyes.
I couldn't help but think, maybe there's a link between what's going on with the Aurora Borealis. whatever energy comes into the atmosphere from that, perhaps those little orbs use that energy to fly.
What is that?
It turns out the northern lights have been especially active lately. In 2024, they were even visible as far south as Florida. Scientists say that's because the sun is in its solar maximum, the peak of its 11-year cycle. Can solar activity explain Bobby's unusual encounter, or will our experts find another source for his sighting? At times, the lights form a V-shape, so we have to consider if they could just be a V-shaped aircraft.
There's a number of aircraft that could match the V shape that we see. The B-2 bomber has a V shape to it. But what they don't have is independent lighting that moves relative to the other lights on board. These lights are actually moving independently. So this is why I think there are 5 independent objects.
What are those 5 independent objects?
The way these lights are moving, it almost seems like a choreographed movement. I think there is a high probability that what we're looking at are drones. This particular day was one of the largest geomagnetic storms to ever hit the Earth. We know that there are a lot of people with their eyes on the sky. And given that the Aurora Borealis hasn't started yet, these drones could be the pre-show.
But if this is a drone show, it's not a particularly visible one.
He had to zoom in to be able to show them better. That's because they were at a relatively high altitude. They might have been at 3,000 feet or 4,000 feet. Drone shows don't occur high up in the sky. They generally occur down low to the ground. And we're not seeing that here.
Instead, like the aurora itself, these flying objects may have a natural explanation.
If you watch Canada geese, you'll see something really impressive. You'll see that the leader is in front during the brunt of the forces hitting him. When the leader gets tired and drops back into the V, another leader will emerge, and we could be seeing these 2 coming up to the lead.
Now, we've seen reflective birds mistaken for UFOs before. However, those had an obvious light source beneath them, a greenhouse. But these don't.
Birds don't produce their own light. If we were looking at birds, there would have to be some sort of light hitting those birds and reflecting back to the Earth. We don't see that here.
Our verdict? Unexplained objects. Between our 2 experts, we can't make a call one way or the other. We'll have to wait and see if any more UFOs emerge from this intense solar activity. Poltergeists are known to haunt houses in a variety of ways, slamming doors, moving furniture. But can they also take over kitchen appliances? Before you answer, take a listen to what this microwave oven was serving up. It's July 2024 in Knoxville, Tennessee. Cecilia and Aaron Hill are home alone when their circuit breaker trips. But when the power returns, something strange happens.
And we hear this talking noise, and we think it's just one of the kids' toys. So I walk into our kitchen, and I don't see anything there. My wife kind of met back in the kitchen, and then we looked at each other, and we realized that sound was coming from the microwave.
There's a strange gasp and deep breathing along with a psychotic voice quickly mumbling the chorus to 2 hit pop songs. Listen again.
It did send, chill down my spine where I was like, this sounds very, very weird. We had no idea what it was.
This crazy story went crazy viral. Many suggested that this microwave was either haunted by a poltergeist or accidentally picking up some type of encoded secret message broadcast from a clandestine number station.
Number stations are pirate shortwave radio stations that send out coded messages to intelligence agents that were used beginning in World War I and most famously during the Cold War Typically, they'd start with something like a short melody, and then there would be a string of letters and numbers for whoever the recipient was to decipher.
Using shortwave radio, a spy could beam signals off the ionosphere to agents almost anywhere on Earth. But since anyone could listen in, the message had to be decoded from numbers to letters using a special key called a one-time pad. One broadcast, called the Lincolnshire Poacher, is believed to have aired for decades from an MI6 site in Cyprus. This technique is still considered effective today, since it can't be jammed or traced like a digital signal.
This message is really difficult to understand, and maybe that's because it's a secret message.
Back in 2022, media around the globe profiled a British man who was trying to give away a refrigerator that he believed was haunted by his stepmother. Sick and tired of the ghost criticizing his cheese intake, the man said the pristine appliance was free to anyone willing to come get it. Could this microwave be the perfect companion piece? Let's go to the experts. Could this microwave be projecting something ghostly?
I think we've been brainwashed by Hollywood, that ghosts communicate at a higher frequency than us with different kinds of gizmos and electronics. But when I was a kid in elementary school, we used to play with diode radios. The diode converts AC into DC, and you can use that to pick up radio signals. So you're not picking up ghosts. You could be picking up a radio station.
Then is it possible that these frequencies are the mysterious transmissions of a top-secret numbers station?
So we would expect it with a numbers station that there would be a sequence of words or codes or numbers that would be uttered as part of the message. And in this case, since it just seems to be somebody humming a pop song, doesn't have the qualities that would lead us to believe that this was a numbers station.
In fact, our expert did some digging and discovered that this particular model of microwave comes with a feature where you can record a message.
It seems clear this is an example of the function of that microwave to have this memo recording and playback feature.
And it turns out the microwave in question came with the house.
It is conceivable that there might be recordings left in the memory of the device. Even the most logical explanation here leaves us with some mystery.
Our verdict? We're calling this one a lost recording. Kinda just came with the house. Who made it and why? We don't know. And maybe we don't want to know. Have you read much H.P. Lovecraft? Well, you should. His stories are nearly 100 years old, but they continue to inspire sci-fi nerds and occultists all over the world. But is it possible that cosmic monsters like the ones you'll find here are actually real? And could they be returning? April 10th, 2024, Pilsen, the Czech Republic. The meteorological mapping company Ventusky provides accessible global weather maps to clients around the world. And the internet goes absolutely wild when this giant, ominous image appears on the screen. A huge, dark mass moves north through the water, heading past the southern tip of Africa. It's an area larger than Texas, spanning 2,000 miles. And according to the reference key, the waves created by this object are over 80 feet high. The shape and movement of this void had many comparing it to one of science fiction's most famous deities.
When this first appeared, there were many who declared it's Cthulhu. Cthulhu is an ancient god that was created by the great horror author H.P. Lovecraft back in the year 1928. It's described as a mountain-sized entity with the head of an octopus, tentacled, clawed hands, and bat-like wings.
According to the story, Cthulhu had been trapped underwater in a forgotten city named Relay, waiting to resurface one day and unleash terror on the land.
Due to Cthulhu's immense size, it's easy to see how people compared it to this mass on this particular map. There are some who think that Lovecraft was some type of savant who was able to look into other realities and draw that information into our world. And so that the idea of Cthulhu was actually real.
One such group, the Typhonian Order, believes that the monsters from Lovecraft's writings were representations of actual beings and extraterrestrials.
One of the common themes throughout Lovecraft's writings is this idea of the great old ones, which were often depicted as ancient deities. They had somehow fallen by the wayside, but they were in a constant struggle to return to power. So were the works of H.P. Lovecraft actually more fact than fiction?
While Lovecraft himself always insisted that the stories of his elder gods were no more than fiction, some fans believe he only did so because both of his parents were committed to psychiatric institutions, and he was fearful of sharing a similar fate if he told what he really knew. Could there be some truth behind these cosmic horrors? And are they connected to this map image? Our experts are ready to share their latest work of nonfiction. Even if you accept that Lovecraft's writings were based on truth, is this even the right place for Cthulhu?
H.P. Lovecraft was an incredibly specific writer. We have an extreme amount of details of Cthulhu. We know where Cthulhu was supposed to live, including the exact coordinates in the middle of the Pacific Ocean. Kind of rules this out because what we're seeing is coming from the Eastern Atlantic.
And if something this large was rising from the ocean, wouldn't we certainly know about it?
When I looked at the scale, we've got over 70, 80 feet of wave heights. The wave heights that are being represented are nearly impossible in the natural world. Now, they would happen if there was a volcanic eruption that displaces hundreds and hundreds of tons of rock, but there was nothing happening. So my first thought was there has to be an error in the model.
So we tracked down Pavel Raholik, who worked for the Ventusky Weather Forecasting Service.
Faulty data got into the system. Within a couple of days, they were able to sort of patch the prediction model, and we thought that was it. But within the time, many of those conspiracy theories arrived on social networks, and we were flooded with comments and various theories.
Our verdict? This is a simple modeling error within the Ventusky weather map system. Surprisingly enough, the #1 suspect on the site's comments section wasn't Cthulhu. That honor went to Godzilla. In ancient Egypt, the process of embalming and preparing a mummy took 70 days. Special priests removed organs, applied salt, and wrapped it in linen. But in 2023, when a dead body seemed to have magically mummified much faster without any of these procedures, we knew there was a mystery to unwrap. September 3rd, 2023, Sofia, Bulgaria. The body of a 34-year-old man is found near some train tracks. Police learn that he matches the description of a person missing for 16 days wearing exactly the same clothes. But it's not just the attire that grabs their attention. It's this. Even though he only died sometime in the last 16 days, his skin looks hard and leathery, as though it's been dried out on purpose. In short, he looks like an ancient mummy. Take a closer look at this photograph of his leg. The skin has a parchment-like texture, while the inner organs have dissolved into dark, shapeless masses.
They find that the internal organs have dried out, the fat has disappeared. Coroners were baffled by this body because it didn't decay in a normal way.
But if he's become a mummy, how? Mummification, preserving a body by drying it, doesn't happen quickly. In fact, In ancient Egypt, mummification was a multi-step process that took 70 days. First, the body was washed with water from the Nile. Then the brain was removed, followed by the rest of the internal organs. Next, embalmers packed the body in natron, a naturally occurring salt that dries the body of all moisture and fat. Finally, the body was wrapped, adorned with amulets, and placed in a sarcophagus.
So no one can quite figure out how this person was mummified within 16 days.
This isn't the first modern mummy mystery. In 2016, a German sailor was found mummified on a yacht drifting in the Philippine Sea. Investigators believe he died of a heart attack or stroke and was preserved in the warm, salty ocean air. But that process likely took weeks or even months, not just 16 days. So what happened in Bulgaria? Let's ask the experts. According to the coroners, the deceased man had consumed a lot of alcohol, and some wonder if this might have caused what we're seeing here.
It is unlikely and doubtful that alcohol in the cells and in the bloodstream would help with the mummification process. Alcohol in the body would damage the organs at a cellular level, but it would not help in the preservation of the tissue once the body dies.
Alcohol is out, but could we be seeing cult activity? A bizarre thought, sure, but in 2021, a Colorado cult managed to mummify its deceased leader.
If this guy was mummified by a cult or by some other person, we would see the traditional methods of mummification. We would see something on his skin to help with that skin drying out. We would see other signs that he was purposely mummified. And we don't see this at all.
So how did this man's corpse mummify just 16 days after he was last seen alive?
Investigators discovered that in the 16 days where this man was missing in Sofia, the conditions were exactly the conditions that would be required for precocious mummification, which is a really rare phenomenon where conditions of temperature, solar radiation, humidity, and airspeed accelerate the mummification process. These conditions include a 24-hour daytime temperature greater than 86 degrees, a solar radiation greater than 600 watts per meter squared, a humidity of less than 50%, with wind speeds up to 20 to 30 miles per hour.
And because he ended up next to the rail station, the hot air from the train driving consistently past him dried his skin out, and then the rest of the process just continued to go on. In only 16 days, this gentleman went from being alive to being a mummy.
Our verdict? Precocious mummification. This was an entirely natural, if extremely rare, process. We're just glad the poor guy wasn't the victim of some strange cult. But modern mummies still don't have anything on the ancient Egyptians. Some estimates say, in addition to people, the Egyptians also mummified 70 million animals. The Nazca lines of Peru are world famous for their strange geometric shapes. But on the other side of the world, we found another set of impressive and mysterious markings. The question is, who made them and why? Wadi Wasad, Jordan. In this swath of the Black Desert is an ancient site local Bedouins call the Works of Old Men. It was discovered by Westerners in the 1920s when pilots flying over the desert looked down and saw this. A series of dark circles on the desert floor. They look like enormous wheels. A closer look reveals the circles are made of arranged rocks. Some of the circles are bisected by winding strips of stone, while others seem to have lines resembling spokes. Aerial archaeologist Dr. Robert Bewley recalls the moment he first laid eyes on this majestic site.
It was a wonderful experience to just fly from one to the other to try and understand what they were, because they are unique in this particular landscape. None of them, as far as I'm aware, have been excavated. They're a fascinating, but as yet, completely unrevealed in terms of their function.
It's that mystery which has led some to an extraterrestrial explanation.
In the 1968 book Chariots of the Gods, it was speculated that the Nazca Lines were actually built as landing sites or as a way for people to communicate with extraterrestrials, which has led others to speculate that perhaps the black wheels of the desert in Jordan are built for the same purpose.
The theory that extraterrestrials might have been present in antiquity isn't new. Sumerian texts speak of a group of godlike beings known as the Anunnaki, who some say were alien visitors. But do we see anything here that suggests an alien influence? First, were one of this area's ancient civilizations behind this?
Jordan has fantastic archaeology, like Petra is the most amazing example. Petra was made by the Nabateans somewhere in the 3rd or 4th century BCE.
The Nabateans were highly resourceful engineers who managed to build an empire in the desert, constructing dams, canals, and reservoirs. Problem is, these circles are way older than the Nabatean culture.
So digging some of these up, we can get a date based on the rock itself, and those dates are coming back very, very early. The earliest of these wheels date back 8,500 years.
We know there were nomadic tribes in the area at the time, so could these be the remains of camps?
Nomadic people, oftentimes they want to band together for safety, and they want to be close, but they also need to subdivide that area practically. So another theory of these areas between the spokes is that they are subdivisions of where various clans are living within the property.
Another theory suggests that the wheels may have had the same purpose proposed for another ancient and mysterious rock structure, Stonehenge.
If you go with the idea of Stonehenge being an astronomical clock or an astronomical calendar, then this could be an astronomical calendar that we see from other indigenous people here on Earth. Another hypothesis is that it was actually a compass helping the ancient people navigate through these regions during this time.
But we admit, these are just best guesses. Who knows? Perhaps they were made to communicate with extraterrestrials, real or imagined.
If you look at the unconformity of the structure, it really makes it very difficult to figure out what it initially was designed for. So in the end, when you look at these kinds of structures, all you have is speculation of what actually they were used for and who used them.
Charlotte had always considered her backyard a sanctuary, a small patch of grass and overgrown shrubs where the world's chaos seemed to soften against the hum of cicadas and the gentle rustle of the oak leaves. It was the night of late spring when everything shifted, a night that would quietly etch itself into her memory as something irreversibly strange. She had been sitting on the creaky wooden bench near the edge of the garden, a book forgotten in her lap, her attention caught by the sky's peculiar sheen. The stars seemed brighter, almost unnaturally so, as if the heavens themselves had been polished for some clandestine inspection. A faint hum, barely perceptible at first, began vibrating through the air, a sound that could have been mistaken for the distant drumming of an airplane engine, but as she focused, the tone shifted, sharp, crystalline, and undeniably alien. Charlotte froze, her fingers tightening around the worn fabric of her cardigan. The garden lights flickered once and then steadied, casting long shadows that danced across the uneven lawn. The scent of damp earth mixed with something else, metallic, electric, an aroma that made the hairs on the back of her neck rise involuntarily. Then she saw it, a light, pale blue and oscillating, hovering just above the treetops at the far edge of her yard. It moved with a fluid grace that defied logic, sidestepping around branches and leaves as if it were conscious of every obstacle, yet it made no sound beyond the low hum that now thrummed in her chest. Charlotte's heart raced, every instinct screaming both fascination and fear, and in that suspended moment, she knew she was witnessing something that defied ordinary explanation. She whispered aloud, half to herself, half in hope that saying it might make it real, "What are you?" The light paused, quivering in the night air, then blinked once, twice, in a cadence that felt deliberate, almost communicative. Her pulse throbbed with the rhythm of the blinking, a primitive mimicry of the unknown. Charlotte's eyes, wide and unblinking, tracked the movement as it descended slowly, lower, until it seemed to hover just above the grass. Then, impossibly, the air itself shimmered, bending like heat over asphalt, and she felt a tug at her consciousness, subtle but undeniable, a gentle insistence that pressed her gaze toward a single point in the yard. It was then she realized the grass beneath her had changed, though she couldn't articulate exactly how. It seemed more vibrant, almost iridescent, as if lit from within by some otherworldly glow. The hum deepened, resonating through her bones, and Charlotte's knees buckled involuntarily. She fell back onto the bench, clutching the wood armrest as her mind swirled with fear, wonder, and disbelief. Her phone, resting beside her, began to vibrate, though no message had come through. The screen flickered, displaying indecipherable symbols, like a code that her brain couldn't translate but that seemed purposeful, a message in a language older than human comprehension. She blinked rapidly, trying to focus, and when she opened her eyes again, the light had shifted position, closer now, pulsing with a rhythm that seemed to echo the very beat of her heart. Charlotte's instincts screamed to flee, but her body refused. She was paralyzed, not by fear alone, but by a gravitational pull of curiosity, a magnetic fascination that wrapped around her like tendrils of smoke. And then it happened. The air around her vibrated violently for a split second, and a sensation like falling upward seized her. Her vision blurred, and the backyard seemed to dissolve into a swirl of colors, a kaleidoscope of blues, greens, and silver lights that moved independently yet harmoniously. She could hear a voice, not with her ears but in her mind, a melodic cadence that made no words but conveyed meaning. Do not fear. You are chosen to witness. Charlotte gasped, her hands pressed against her temples as if to hold her sanity in place, and when she dared to open her eyes again, she was no longer alone. Shadows flickered at the edges of her vision, humanoid yet indistinct, figures that shimmered with translucence, their forms shifting, elongating, and compressing in ways that defied natural anatomy. They were here, in her backyard, yet not of it, entities observing her as intently as she observed them. She wanted to scream, to run, to call for help, but no sound emerged, only the rhythmic pulse of light that seemed to synchronize with her heartbeat. A figure stepped forward, more defined than the others, a pale luminescence tracing the contours of a humanoid shape. It extended a limb, or what she interpreted as a limb, toward her, and in that gesture, Charlotte felt a wave of understanding, an inexplicable comprehension of purpose and presence. Her fear began to morph, folding into awe, a reverent acknowledgement of something far beyond her human understanding. Time itself seemed to stretch, moments elongating into a continuum where each heartbeat, each blink, each breath was magnified into eternity. Charlotte's senses were heightened. She could feel the vibrations of the earth through the soles of her feet, hear the faint rustle of leaves in the distant forest, detect the metallic tang of the air, all layered atop the resonant hum that now seemed to come from both outside and within her. Then, in a moment that shattered her perception of reality, the figure drew closer, the light around it intensifying, enveloping Charlotte in a warmth that was neither fire nor electricity but something alien, vital, a force that made her feel simultaneously insignificant and central to the universe's vast design. She felt herself lifted, not physically in the conventional sense, but her consciousness was pulled into a stream of vision, a torrent of images that cascaded over her mind, stars forming and collapsing, civilizations rising and fading, beings communicating through color, thought, and vibration rather than sound. She experienced lifetimes in seconds, histories not her own but understood with perfect clarity, an archive of the cosmos shared in a fleeting communion. Then, as abruptly as it began, the torrent ceased, and Charlotte found herself back on the wooden bench, the light receding into the distance, disappearing over the treetops. Her body trembled, sweat cooling on her skin, heart hammering with the residue of something impossible. She looked around. The backyard was unchanged, yet nothing felt ordinary anymore. Grass, trees, the garden gnomes she had placed last summer, they were the same, yet imbued with a sense of latent significance, as if the entire universe had whispered a secret in her ear. Charlotte's phone beeped. A single message, texted from an unknown number, containing only 3 words, "Do not forget." She stared at the screen, her mind racing. Forget? How could she forget something that had altered the very fabric of her perception? The hum had faded, the night returned to normalcy, but an unshakable certainty lingered. This was only the beginning. Something had chosen her, something vast and unknowable, and she could feel the threads of her life stretching taut, connected to events she could not yet comprehend. Sleep would not come that night. Even the familiar comfort of her home seemed alien, the walls whispering of mysteries she had only glimpsed. Charlotte wandered from room to room, touching objects, grounding herself, yet each familiar texture seemed infused with hidden meaning. The books on her shelf, her collection of pressed flowers, photographs of her family, they were relics in a universe that had just revealed itself to her, reminders of the human scale against the cosmic vastness she had encountered. And then, as dawn crept over the horizon, painting the sky in tentative strokes of pink and gold, Charlotte felt a presence in the air, a soft vibration that spoke not to her ears but to her consciousness, a promise and a warning intertwined. The event of last night was not an isolated incident. It was an opening, a gateway into understanding, danger, and revelation. The backyard, once a mundane refuge, had become a threshold. And Charlotte, whether ready or not, had stepped across it. The morning after the encounter, Charlotte woke to a world that felt both familiar and estranged, as though reality itself had been subtly rewritten overnight. She moved through her apartment with an eerie awareness, each step measured, each sound amplified, the faucet dripping in the kitchen, the refrigerator humming, the distant wail of a siren from the city streets, all layered into a symphony of mundane details she could no longer take for granted. Her thoughts kept returning to the blue light, the figures, and that inexplicable pull that had stretched her consciousness into what could only be described as communion with something not of this earth. She had tried to recount the night's events to herself rationally, to find a logical explanation, a drone, a hallucination, perhaps even the onset of some neurological anomaly, but nothing fit. No shadow of doubt could diminish the vivid clarity with which she remembered the vibration of the air, the metallic scent, the feeling of being lifted yet entirely conscious. By mid-morning, Charlotte decided she could no longer remain passive. She needed evidence, something tangible to anchor her experience, or at least to verify that she had not imagined it all. She grabbed her camera, a modest DSLR she usually used for photographing flowers and backyard birds, and returned to the garden, her heartbeat quickening as she stepped onto the familiar grass. The ground beneath her feet felt ordinary, yet the air carried the faint hum of residual energy, a low, almost imperceptible vibration that made her fingertips tingle. Charlotte moved to the edge of the yard, scanning the treetops and horizon, the camera clicking as she tried to capture any anomaly. Nothing appeared in the photos, just leaves, shadows, and the soft, diffuse sunlight, but when she replayed the images on her computer, she noticed subtle distortions in the pixels, minute areas where the light warped, as if reality itself had been slightly bent. It was not proof in the conventional sense, but it was enough to confirm that the encounter had left a trace. Charlotte's curiosity was now compounded by an insistent, almost obsessive need to understand what had happened and why she had been chosen. She researched relentlessly, diving into forums, declassified reports, and obscure scientific journals. She discovered accounts of unexplained aerial phenomena, electromagnetic anomalies, and even stories of missing persons linked to strange lights in rural backyards. One article referenced a series of incidents similar in description to what she had experienced: a bluish light, humanoid figures with translucent forms, telepathic impressions, and a temporary shift in perception of time and space. Her pulse quickened. The article suggested that these events were not isolated, that some phenomenon was recurring, targeting specific individuals, and leaving them forever changed. By evening, Charlotte had arranged for a small setup in her backyard: motion sensors, infrared cameras, and a magnetic field detector borrowed from a local university's physics department after she explained she was conducting a personal experiment on electromagnetic anomalies. She positioned herself on the bench, heart hammering, her fingers hovering over the camera's shutter. The sky darkened, and the familiar hum returned, not loud, not intrusive, but present, vibrating in harmony with her heartbeat. Then, as if on cue, the blue light emerged again, hovering just above the treetops, moving with the same fluid grace as the previous night. Charlotte's breath caught. She raised the camera, snapping photos, recording video, even though rational thought warned her that this might be futile. The light pulsed, the rhythm echoing that strange cadence she had experienced before, and once more the shimmering figures appeared, surrounding the area with silent observation. One of them, the pale luminescent humanoid, stepped forward and extended a limb in the same gesture as before. Charlotte felt the pull, subtle but unmistakable, drawing her attention, compelling her focus, inviting her awareness to expand. She realized she had been waiting for this moment, not passively, but with a readiness she didn't fully understand. And as the shimmer intensified, she sensed something new, an emotional resonance, a flood of empathy that overwhelmed her, allowing her to perceive not just the presence of these beings but their intention. They were observers, yes, but also communicators, attempting to bridge the gap between human comprehension and a larger cosmic truth. Charlotte's mind flooded with images again: celestial maps, intricate networks of energy connecting stars and planets, beings communicating through color and vibration rather than language. She understood, in a way she could scarcely describe, that her own consciousness was now part of this network, a node in a web stretching across light years. The sensation was intoxicating, terrifying, exhilarating. Hours seemed to stretch and compress, yet Charlotte remained fully aware, recording, absorbing, attempting to document something fundamentally indescribable. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the light retracted, the figures dissipated, and the backyard returned to its ordinary state. Charlotte's equipment confirmed anomalies: spikes in magnetic readings, erratic interference in video footage, and temperature fluctuations that could not be explained by weather or electrical faults. She stared at the data, a mixture of triumph and disbelief coursing through her. Proof existed, not perfect, not fully comprehensible, but undeniable. Exhausted yet exhilarated, Charlotte retreated indoors, reviewing every frame of her recordings. The pale humanoid's gestures, the flickering lights, the slight distortions in the camera images, they were all there, begging for interpretation. Over the next few days, Charlotte noticed subtle changes in herself. She could sense electromagnetic fluctuations with increasing accuracy, predict patterns of light in the sky, and experience moments of heightened intuition that bordered on precognition. Sleep became irregular, her dreams vivid with cosmic imagery, sprawling star maps, silent beings of light, endless corridors of energy. She awoke each morning with fragments of understanding that she could not articulate but that hinted at a larger purpose. One evening, as she walked through the garden, Charlotte felt a presence behind her, not threatening, but insistent. Turning, she saw no one, yet the hum returned, the residual vibration threading through her awareness. She whispered, "I'm ready," unsure whether she was speaking to the beings, the universe, or her own subconscious. And then she noticed a new anomaly in the grass, a pattern faintly etched into the soil, not by hand, but as if the energy had been impressed upon the ground itself. It resembled a symbol, geometric yet organic, pulsing with subtle light when she approached. Charlotte traced the lines with her fingertips, a thrill of recognition coursing through her. It was a message, a confirmation, a map, she could not yet say what. That night, she attempted to sleep but remained alert, expecting the return of the light. Hours passed, shadows lengthening across the walls, until finally a sudden illumination filled the room. The blue light had entered through the window, coalescing in the corner of her room, forming the familiar shape of the pale humanoid. It spoke, again not through sound, but through thought, a cascade of impressions and emotions. This time, the message was clearer: you are not alone. Others have seen. Others have been chosen. Your role is observation, documentation, and preparation. Charlotte nodded, tears streaming, a mixture of fear and acceptance. She understood that this was not a fleeting encounter but the beginning of an ongoing process, one that would challenge every assumption she held about reality. Over the following week, Charlotte began to notice patterns in the visitation. The blue light would appear in rhythmic intervals, often synchronized with specific atmospheric phenomena, magnetic fluctuations, or even her own heightened intuition. Each event left behind subtle traces, slight impressions in soil, faint residual energy detectable by her instruments, distortions in electronic signals, and occasional glimpses of figures at the periphery of her vision. She documented everything meticulously, creating logs, diagrams, and time-stamped photographs, convinced that these records might one day serve as proof not just for herself, but for a world unprepared to understand. Friends and neighbors noticed changes in Charlotte, her focus, her quiet intensity, but she could not explain without risking disbelief or ridicule. Her journal became a sanctuary, a repository of observations, emotions, and fragments of comprehension that exceeded ordinary language. She began to see patterns not only in the sky but in human behavior, coincidences, and subtle synchronicities that suggested a connectivity she had never before perceived. One evening, while reviewing her footage, Charlotte noticed something she had overlooked, a shadow moving independently of the figures, an entity darker and more defined than the shimmering humanoids, lingering at the edge of the frame. It observed, but did not approach. The sense of intelligence and purpose was undeniable, yet its intent remained opaque. Fear threaded through her fascination, adding urgency to her investigations. She realized that whatever these beings were, they operated on a spectrum, some benevolent, some inscrutable, some perhaps indifferent or even hostile. And so, Charlotte resolved to remain vigilant, to prepare not only for communion but for confrontation, to understand the signs before the phenomena escalated. Nights became a continuous vigil, punctuated by the arrival of light, the presence of the figures, and the occasional inexplicable events that defied scientific rationale. Over time, Charlotte began to notice physical changes in herself, enhanced perception, heightened sensitivity to electromagnetic fields, and a subtle increase in cognitive speed and pattern recognition. These changes, while exhilarating, were accompanied by isolation, a creeping awareness that her reality had diverged irreversibly from the ordinary world. In the quiet moments of dawn, she would walk through the backyard, tracing the edges of the garden with her hands, noting shifts in the soil, patterns in the grass, and faint residual energy lingering where the light had touched. She began to sketch these patterns, attempting to translate them into a language humans might someday understand. Each day reinforced a singular truth: the universe was more complex, more interconnected, and far stranger than she had ever imagined. And Charlotte, chosen or marked by circumstance, had become its observer, its witness, and perhaps, its messenger. Charlotte's nights had grown into a delicate balance of anticipation and unease. Each evening, as twilight bled into darkness, she would position herself on the bench, camera at the ready, instruments aligned, and heart pounding with the expectancy of the unknown. She had learned to recognize the subtle precursors of the phenomenon, a faint metallic scent in the air, the temperature dipping slightly despite the warmth of late spring, and the hum, soft at first, then swelling in resonance until it seemed to vibrate through her very bones. Over time, these signals became as natural to her as the sound of her own heartbeat, yet the thrill and terror never dulled. One particularly quiet night, the sky was clear, stars scattered like diamonds against black velvet, and the moon a thin crescent barely illuminating the backyard. Charlotte felt the familiar pull, stronger this time, as though the beings were trying to draw her attention more urgently. The blue light appeared, gliding across the yard with its fluid, deliberate motion. But something was different. It was accompanied by a low, pulsing vibration that seemed almost sentient, modulating in tone and rhythm, conveying emotion rather than sound. The pale humanoid emerged, extending its limb in the familiar gesture, but the other figures lingered at a distance, their presence watchful yet restrained. Charlotte held her breath as the light enveloped her, and her consciousness expanded once again, carried into a cascade of visions that defied linear time. She saw cities on distant planets, towering crystalline structures, and vast networks of energy connecting stars. She experienced the thoughts of beings whose forms were incomprehensible to human eyes, geometries of consciousness that transcended physicality, communicating through light, vibration, and pure awareness. Amid this torrent of experience, a new presence emerged, darker and more solid than the luminescent figures she had encountered before. It did not speak, but she felt its awareness probing hers, testing, assessing, as though measuring her resilience, her comprehension, her capacity to bear the truth of what she was witnessing. A wave of fear rolled through her, yet she held steady, knowing instinctively that yielding would mean losing her connection, her role as witness. The light receded, leaving her back in the backyard, knees on the grass, chest heaving, the stars above now seeming smaller, more distant than ever. Charlotte's instruments confirmed anomalies once again, temperature drops, magnetic spikes, visual distortions, but it was the data that frightened her least. It was the shadow, the sense of observation from a presence she could not identify, that lingered in the corners of her mind. Over the next days, Charlotte found herself hyper-aware of her environment, noticing subtle shifts in her surroundings that she would have previously ignored, birds taking sudden flight, leaves trembling despite still air, distant lights blinking in ways that suggested coordination rather than coincidence. Each observation reinforced the sense that the backyard, once mundane, had become a threshold between ordinary reality and something far greater, something both wondrous and incomprehensible. She began experimenting with communication, attempting to respond to the being's gestures and pulses of light. Small movements, subtle shifts in posture, or the manipulation of objects, turning a garden gnome, placing a reflective surface in a specific spot, elicited changes in the light, slight variations in rhythm or intensity, suggesting acknowledgement. It was tentative, primitive, but it confirmed that interaction, however limited, was possible. One night, Charlotte awoke to find the entire room illuminated with soft blue radiance. The figures were inside, hovering silently, their forms undisturbed by walls or physical barriers. The pale humanoid extended its limb toward her again, and the familiar pull transported her consciousness into visions more vivid than any she had experienced. This time, she saw her own backyard not as she knew it, but as part of a larger network, a lattice of nodes and conduits of energy stretching across the globe. Each backyard, each isolated field, each point of light in human perception was a conduit, a site of interaction between the beings and humanity. And she realized, with a mix of awe and dread, that she was not alone in this experience. Others were witnessing, participating, chosen in ways she could not yet discern. The visions conveyed fragments of purpose, fragments of a mission she could not fully grasp. It was clear, however, that observation alone was insufficient. Preparation, understanding, and perhaps even dissemination of knowledge would be required. Charlotte's mind reeled with possibilities, fear interlaced with the intoxicating clarity of insight. Over the following days, she began to notice changes in her own behavior and abilities. She could sense the approach of the blue light even before it manifested visually, detect minute fluctuations in electromagnetic fields, and feel the subtle intentions of other beings in ways she could not articulate. Sleep became more fragmented, punctuated by visions that bled into waking moments, glimpses of distant worlds, structures of impossible geometry, and entities communicating through sequences of color and vibration. She began to sketch these visions, attempting to render them in human terms, though she knew the representation was inevitably incomplete. Her apartment filled with notebooks, diagrams, and strange symbols, a visual archive of encounters, experiences, and impressions. During one of these sketching sessions, Charlotte noticed a shadow at the periphery of her vision, subtle, darker than the luminous figures, watching, waiting. She felt an instinctive caution, a warning embedded deep within her awareness, and yet she could not look away. The shadow did not move toward her, did not interact, but the sense of intelligence, of awareness, was undeniable. It was a silent observer, a reminder that the universe she was glimpsing was layered, complex, and not entirely benign. Weeks passed, and Charlotte's routine solidified into a disciplined pattern of observation, documentation, and reflection. Each night brought new insights, small correspondences between gestures and responses, subtle fluctuations in energy that hinted at larger patterns. She began to hypothesize, drawing connections between electromagnetic anomalies, meteorological conditions, and the appearance of the blue light. Though speculative, these hypotheses provided a framework, however fragile, to structure her understanding. One particularly intense night, the phenomena escalated. The backyard was flooded with light, figures multiplied, and the shadowed presence moved closer, though still intangible. Charlotte's heart raced as the luminescent humanoids pulsed in unison, their collective rhythm creating a resonance that seemed to envelop the entire neighborhood. She felt her consciousness being drawn outward, connected to notes she could not perceive directly, part of a larger network of awareness. In this state, she glimpsed events unfolding elsewhere, other chosen individuals, similar encounters, patterns of interaction she could barely comprehend. The scope of what she was witnessing was staggering, a cosmic choreography in which humanity was only a small, yet significant, participant. When she returned fully to her body, knees pressed into the grass, chest heaving, Charlotte realized that the shadow had remained, lingering longer than before, its purpose still opaque. She sensed that it represented a challenge, perhaps a test of endurance, comprehension, or even ethical discernment. The beings had chosen her, yes, but not for comfort or ease. She was now part of an ongoing process, a role that demanded vigilance, courage, and the willingness to confront unknown dimensions of reality. As days turned into weeks, Charlotte's understanding deepened incrementally. She began cross-referencing her observations with historical accounts of unexplained aerial phenomena, reports of abductions, and documented electromagnetic anomalies. Patterns emerged, suggesting a recurring phenomenon that spanned decades, perhaps centuries. The encounters were not random, they were coordinated, targeted, and intentionally subtle, designed to integrate perception and comprehension over time rather than overwhelm. In her solitude, she began experimenting with communication at higher levels, attempting to influence the light, gesture patterns, and even local magnetic fields through her own focused attention and mental projection. The results were uneven, tentative, but they demonstrated that interaction was possible beyond passive observation. She was learning, evolving, becoming a conduit, an intermediary between human awareness and the incomprehensible intelligence of the entities. And yet, the shadow remained, a constant reminder of unknown consequences, of the limits of understanding, and of the thin line between revelation and peril. Charlotte had stepped irrevocably into a new reality, a universe where backyard fences became portals, lights in the night conveyed meaning, and consciousness extended beyond the familiar boundaries of body and mind. She understood that her journey was just beginning, that each observation, each interaction, each moment of insight was a thread in a tapestry far larger than her own comprehension. And as she watched the blue light once more glide above the treetops, she realized that she was not merely witnessing events, she was participating in an unfolding cosmic narrative, a story in which humanity's perception, understanding, and perhaps survival were quietly interwoven with the enigmatic forces she had begun to glimpse. Charlotte's sense of time had warped, the lines between night and day blurring as her experiences in the backyard intensified. Each evening brought new patterns, fresh anomalies, and deeper connections that she struggled to fully articulate. She could feel the subtle shifts in magnetic fields hours before the blue light appeared, an intuitive sensitivity that extended even into her dreams. The backyard, once mundane and protective, had become a laboratory, a theater of cosmic interaction where she was both observer and participant. Her documentation became meticulous, each note, sketch, and photograph layered with precise timestamps, observations about light intensity, wind patterns, temperature shifts, and behavioral responses of the luminescent figures. She often replayed footage, frame by frame, examining every flicker, every movement, in search of patterns that might reveal a method to the apparent randomness. Charlotte began to notice minor inconsistencies in her environment that she had previously overlooked, familiar objects slightly displaced, subtle scratches in the wooden bench, traces in the soil that resembled symbols or runes, faint enough that they could be dismissed as coincidence but persistent enough to suggest intentionality. She experimented with leaving reflective surfaces in the yard, small mirrors and metallic objects, curious whether they might alter the light's behavior or provide a new form of communication. Often, the light pulsed more intensely around these objects, weaving around them, interacting as if acknowledging her attempts. One night, as she positioned her instruments and waited in silence, the blue light appeared earlier than usual. The figures emerged, more numerous than before, moving in precise, synchronized patterns that seemed to map the yard in geometric formations she could not fully comprehend. The pale humanoid approached, extending its limb in the familiar gesture, and Charlotte felt the familiar pull, a gentle but insistent tug at her consciousness. Her mind expanded, once again swept into visions of interstellar networks, civilizations that communicated entirely through energy patterns, and vast, intricate lattices connecting planets and stars. Amid this overwhelming flow, she perceived subtle new layers, intricate currents of emotion, intention, and what she could only interpret as moral discernment. The figures were not merely observing, they were analyzing, assessing, and in some subtle, ineffable way, teaching. A shift occurred in her awareness. She understood that her role was evolving. Observation alone was no longer sufficient. She was being prepared, trained, or at least guided, to interpret, to act, to integrate human understanding with the broader cosmic systems she glimpsed. After the encounter, Charlotte retreated to her sketches and notes with renewed urgency. The symbols she had begun documenting weeks prior now formed patterns that suggested language, logic, and a kind of nonlinear narrative. She realized that the figures' movements, the timing of the blue light, and the distortions captured on her instruments were all pieces of a puzzle, fragments of communication designed to slowly transmit knowledge. As she reconstructed sequences and compared repeated occurrences, she began to hypothesize a framework for the messages, tentatively correlating shifts in light intensity, duration, and positioning with symbolic meaning. It was painstaking, frustrating, and exhilarating. But the The darker presence remained, always at the edge of perception, a silent, inscrutable observer whose intent Charlotte could not decipher. Its presence was a source of unease, a reminder that while the luminescent figures seemed benevolent or instructive, other forces were at play, operating beyond comprehension or moral alignment. Her personal life had begun to fragment under the weight of these experiences. Sleep was increasingly disrupted by intense visions, her daily routines punctuated by involuntary flashes of insight, some useful, others disorienting. Friends noticed a change in her demeanor, her intensity, the distant gaze, her relentless focus, but Charlotte could not confide in them without risking disbelief or ridicule. The isolation she felt was tempered only by the knowledge that her observations might be crucial, her documentation a bridge between human perception and phenomena that the wider world had yet to acknowledge. Then came the first physical manifestation she could not explain, small, circular impressions in the soil, each measuring precisely 2 inches across, arranged in patterns that echoed the figures' nighttime formations. They appeared overnight, with no trace of human or animal interference, their edges subtly glowing under moonlight. Charlotte examined them with growing awe and trepidation, realizing that these patterns were not mere coincidence. The ground itself had become a canvas for communication. Using mirrors, sensors, and reflective materials, she attempted to interact with the formations, moving objects, creating shapes, and adjusting light sources. Responses were immediate, the blue light pulsed faster, figures shifted positions, and the impressions seemed to subtly alter in alignment with her interventions. For the first time, Charlotte felt that she was co-creating the phenomenon, an active participant in a dialogue that transcended conventional language. Days later, a stronger, more vivid pulsing filled the backyard. The blue light was intense, almost overwhelming, accompanied by multiple figures moving in intricate patterns that created a sense of three-dimensional geometry in the space around her. The pale humanoid approached more directly, and as Charlotte concentrated on the symbols she had been developing, she experienced a connection that went beyond vision or thought. An emotional resonance, a telepathic understanding, flowed into her, curiosity, trust, and an urgent encouragement to observe more deeply, integrate, and prepare. But simultaneously, the shadow drew closer, its presence unsettling, probing. Charlotte felt an instinctive caution. The knowledge she was receiving came with responsibility, and the darker force seemed to be evaluating her capacity to wield it without being overwhelmed. Sleep that night was impossible. Charlotte wandered the backyard, notebook in hand, tracing the symbols and formations, attempting to map the geometry of the lights and impressions. She felt her consciousness stretching, not fully voluntary, drawn into a complex understanding of space, time, and energy flow that her brain could barely contain. Hours passed as if compressed into minutes, and when the light finally withdrew, she collapsed onto the bench, exhausted yet electrified, understanding that the threshold she had crossed was irreversible. Over the following week, Charlotte experimented further. She began introducing subtle variations, objects of different shapes and materials, changes in her positioning, adjustments to the camera angles, to see how the light and figures responded. Each experiment yielded insights. The figures appeared sensitive not only to intention but also to precision, rhythm, and pattern. A complex, evolving system of interaction was emerging, and Charlotte realized she was only beginning to grasp the basics of a communication methodology that could span dimensions beyond her ordinary perception. Her body had begun to show changes as well. Heightened reflexes, acute sensory perception, and a barely perceptible sense of anticipation for the blue light became constant. Each heartbeat seemed to echo with the pulsing rhythm of the phenomena. Everyday sounds, the wind, distant traffic, the subtle shift of air through her apartment, carried information she could interpret subconsciously. The distinction between dream and waking perception blurred, leaving her in a semi-continuous state of observation and awareness. And then, one night, the phenomena escalated in a way that shattered even Charlotte's growing confidence. The blue light appeared at multiple points across the yard simultaneously, each instance pulsing in coordination yet independently directed. Figures multiplied, forming layers, weaving intricate patterns in space and energy that seemed to defy the constraints of human geometry. The shadow, previously peripheral, emerged closer, its presence undeniable, almost sentient in its observation. Charlotte felt a rush of fear tempered by understanding. The process was accelerating, testing her, challenging her capacity to comprehend and participate without losing herself in the overwhelming complexity. She attempted to respond through gestures, movements, and manipulation of the environment, noting that the figures reacted with heightened synchronization when her actions aligned with the patterns she had documented. A connection, fragile yet tangible, had been established. Exhausted, yet profoundly aware, Charlotte remained in the backyard long after the phenomena subsided. Her instruments confirmed anomalies, temperature variations, electromagnetic spikes, visual distortions, but it was the felt experience, the direct resonance with consciousness, that she could not fully quantify. The shadow lingered in memory, a persistent reminder that the universe she had glimpsed was layered, complex, and not entirely benevolent. Charlotte understood now that her role was not simply to observe but to interpret, adapt, and perhaps influence. The backyard had become a crucible, the blue light a teacher, and the shadow a challenge. Every pulse, every flicker, every impression in the soil, air, or energy field was a lesson, a test, and a revelation all at once. And as she retreated indoors, notebook brimming with sketches and observations, Charlotte realized that her life had irrevocably changed. The universe was no longer a distant abstraction, but a tangible, interacting reality, and she had become its witness, participant, and conduit. The intensity of the phenomena had begun to reshape Charlotte's perception of reality. Even during daylight, long after the blue light had vanished for the night, she could feel its subtle echoes, like faint ripples in the air around her, a hum that threaded through the fabric of her senses. She had become hyper-aware of patterns in both the natural and human world, the swaying of branches, the flight of birds, the flickering of distant city lights, even the cadence of voices on the streets seemed to resonate with hidden rhythms she could now detect instinctively. These patterns were not always predictable, and their implications were sometimes frightening in their complexity. Charlotte documented everything compulsively, creating meticulous logs, charts, and diagrams in an effort to discern meaning, to map the interactions she was beginning to understand, even though the sheer volume of information threatened to overwhelm her mind. She had come to see the backyard as a nexus point, a bridge between human perception and something far larger, a location where cosmic forces could manifest and communicate directly with a prepared consciousness. The blue light had returned more frequently, appearing in multiple locations at once, pulsing in intricate sequences. The figures multiplied, layering across dimensions, moving in ways that suggested intelligence far beyond human understanding. And yet, the shadow, the darker, more solid presence, remained. Its intentions remained inscrutable, a reminder that while the luminous beings offered insight and interaction, not all elements of this cosmic system were benevolent or even comprehensible. One evening, Charlotte placed a series of small metallic objects in precise geometric arrangements, hoping to provoke a response from the figures. She had noticed that particular configurations elicited more complex light patterns, more synchronized movements, and subtle changes in intensity, as if she were beginning to learn the rules of an alien language, albeit in its earliest, rudimentary stages. The pale humanoid approached once again, its form radiating calm, focused energy. As Charlotte extended her own hand toward the figure, she felt the familiar pull, lifting her consciousness into visions that defied description. She saw distant galaxies connected by streams of energy, civilizations that existed entirely in forms of consciousness rather than matter, and networks of intelligence weaving through space-time itself. This time, the message was more coherent, understanding was cumulative, observation alone insufficient, preparation and participation were required. Charlotte realized that she was being trained, her human consciousness stretched incrementally to comprehend phenomena on a scale that was almost impossible to integrate. The shadow was present during these visions, probing, testing, and observing her responses. It introduced an element of tension, suggesting that her comprehension must be tempered by judgment and resilience, that awareness alone carried responsibility. After the encounter, Charlotte retreated to her sketches and notes, attempting to reconstruct the sequences, symbols, and movements she had witnessed. She noticed subtle correlations with natural events, fluctuations in atmospheric pressure, magnetic anomalies, even the behavior of animals nearby. Each insight expanded her understanding, yet also magnified the complexity she had to navigate. Sleep became erratic. Charlotte experienced waking dreams, periods of semi-conscious observation in which she perceived the environment layered with additional dimensions, subtle currents of energy, faint glimmers of figures in periphery, and the shadow moving with deliberate purpose, always testing boundaries. She realized that her senses were no longer fully her own, they had been expanded, augmented, aligned to perceive dimensions and frequencies imperceptible to ordinary humans. During one particularly vivid night, the blue light appeared in unprecedented intensity. The figures formed elaborate geometric sequences, pulsating in ways that created an almost three-dimensional lattice above the yard. The pale humanoid extended its limb, and Charlotte felt herself drawn into an intricate exchange of consciousness. The visions revealed connections not only across space but time. She glimpsed previous encounters, historical patterns of observation, and glimpses of individuals in other parts of the world who had been similarly selected and influenced. Each thread reinforced the notion that she was part of a network, an interconnected web of awareness stretching across the globe. The shadow moved closer during this session, its presence more distinct, almost corporeal. Charlotte felt a shiver of instinctive fear but understood that fleeing or resisting was not an option. The process demanded engagement, comprehension, and endurance. The encounter ended abruptly, leaving Charlotte kneeling on the damp grass, chest heaving, overwhelmed by a mixture of awe, fear, and exhaustion. Over the following week, she experimented with more complex interactions, using combinations of light, mirrors, gestures, and sensor feedback to communicate with the figures. The results were nuanced, subtle alterations in pulse frequency, slight changes in movement patterns, and occasional modifications of the impressions left in the soil. These interactions demonstrated that communication was possible, and that the figures responded to precision, intention, and pattern recognition. At the same time, Charlotte observed that the shadow remained, evaluating her engagement, measuring her resilience, and perhaps preparing her for something she could not yet anticipate. Her mental and physical state had adapted in extraordinary ways. She was more alert, more aware of minute changes in her environment, and increasingly capable of interpreting signals invisible to others. Ordinary human distractions, the television, phone calls, casual conversation, seemed trivial, almost intrusive. Charlotte had become attuned to a new reality, one in which her backyard was both stage and laboratory, where cosmic intelligences demonstrated presence, intention, and pattern, and where her role as observer, interpreter, and participant was expanding beyond previous limits. The phenomena escalated again, now accompanied by subtle auditory impressions in the form of vibrations she could sense rather than hear. The figures moved with precision, creating complex interactions with light and space. Charlotte sensed an underlying logic. The sequences were instructions, lessons encoded in movement, rhythm, and resonance, meant to teach, prepare, and test her capacity for integration. She attempted to respond in kind, using her hands to trace patterns in the soil, manipulate reflective surfaces, and alter sensor placements. The figures reacted, confirming that interaction was not only possible but integral to the unfolding process. Days became a continuous cycle of observation, documentation, and interaction. Charlotte noticed a progression in the phenomena. The light now communicated more sophisticated patterns, the figures demonstrated awareness of her responses, and the shadow became increasingly active, maintaining a subtle pressure on her concentration and judgment. She realized that she was undergoing a transformation, not physical, but cognitive and perceptual, expanding the boundaries of what her human mind could interpret. One night, the phenomena culminated in a sequence so complex that Charlotte initially feared she would be unable to comprehend it. The light formed an intricate lattice across the yard, figures moved in multiple layers, and the shadow lingered close, its presence a silent enforcer of her attention and discipline. Charlotte focused, recalling every previous observation, every sketch, every subtle alteration she had introduced, and slowly began to perceive coherence within the chaos. Patterns emerged, sequences aligned, and for the first time, she experienced a profound clarity that suggested she had integrated a small fraction of the system's logic. Exhausted, exhilarated, and deeply aware, Charlotte collapsed on the bench, realizing that the backyard, the blue light, the figures, and even the shadow had become extensions of a larger, incomprehensible design in which she had been chosen to participate. She understood, with a mixture of dread and awe, that this was only the beginning. The encounters, the patterns, the visions, they were preparing her for something greater, a role she could not yet fully articulate, in a universe where observation, interpretation, and integration were inseparable from existence itself. The shadow's gaze lingered in memory, reminding her that knowledge carried responsibility, awareness carried danger, and that the cosmic system she was glimpsing operated on a scale far beyond ordinary human comprehension. And as Charlotte lay on the grass, notebook open, hands trembling, heart pounding, she realized that she had crossed a threshold from which there was no return. She was now an active participant in a network of intelligence, a conduit for cosmic observation, and a witness to forces that would continue to challenge her understanding, perception, and very sense of self. Charlotte awoke to a new awareness, a quiet yet insistent sense that her perception had permanently shifted. The backyard, familiar yet transformed, now radiated a subtle vibrational frequency she could feel through the soles of her feet, the tips of her fingers, and even the hairs on her arms. Each blade of grass, each leaf on the oak trees, each garden ornament seemed to carry a faint residual energy, as though the blue light had left permanent signatures upon the environment. She moved slowly through the space, cataloging minor anomalies, small, circular impressions in the soil that had not been there before, faint discolorations in the grass, and the gentle quiver of air that heralded the approach of the unknown. Charlotte realized that the phenomena had evolved beyond nightly appearances. The environment itself now responded to her awareness and presence. Instruments became increasingly secondary to her own senses. Her mind was a finely tuned receptor, capable of detecting minute electromagnetic fluctuations, subtle changes in air pressure, and the almost imperceptible thrum of energy she could no longer explain rationally. She noted these changes in her notebooks, though she understood that words could never fully capture the depth of experience. That evening, she prepared her usual setup, cameras, mirrors, sensors, but with a new intent. She had begun experimenting with more deliberate communication, attempting to influence the light and figures rather than merely observe them. She arranged small reflective panels in patterns designed to redirect beams of energy, anticipating that the figures would recognize her attempts at interaction. The backyard fell silent. The world outside seemed to pause, as if it too were awaiting the signal. Then, with no warning, the blue light appeared, brighter and more complex than ever. It oscillated in rhythm, moving with precision across the yard, interacting with her arrangements. Figures emerged from the shadows, layering in three-dimensional formations that danced above the grass. The pale humanoid approached, its presence a calm anchor amidst the overwhelming display. Charlotte felt the familiar pull, drawing her consciousness outward, into the network of intelligence she had glimpsed in previous nights. But tonight, the experience was more intense, more encompassing. She perceived multiple layers of awareness simultaneously, the luminescent beings, the flow of energy across the yard, and an overarching intelligence that connected distant points she could not yet identify. Amid this flood of perception, the shadow appeared more distinctly than ever before, moving closer with a deliberate, almost sentient curiosity. Unlike the luminescent figures, it did not communicate in light or resonance. Its presence alone was a message, challenging Charlotte's focus, judgment, and endurance. The visions she experienced transcended ordinary comprehension. She saw entire civilizations existing as patterns of energy, interacting through vibration and light rather than matter. She perceived other chosen humans across the globe, each interacting with their own phenomena in unique but interconnected ways. Time seemed fluid, compressing years into moments and stretching seconds into eternities. Charlotte's understanding expanded, yet she was acutely aware of the shadow's scrutiny. The implication was unmistakable: comprehension carried responsibility, and her engagement must be measured, deliberate, and ethically conscious. When the vision subsided, Charlotte collapsed onto the grass, trembling with exertion and exhilaration. Her instruments recorded the anomalies, spikes in electromagnetic fields, temperature fluctuations, and visual distortions, yet she knew the most significant changes were internal, imperceptible to technology. Over the following days, Charlotte's senses continued to adapt. She became aware of subtle vibrations in her own body, the rhythm of her heartbeat echoing the pulse of the phenomena, her thoughts resonating with the oscillations of energy around her. Ordinary life seemed distant, trivial, almost irrelevant. Friends and colleagues noticed changes in her demeanor, her intensity, her distracted gaze, her obsession with the backyard, but Charlotte could not explain without risking disbelief. She had become a node in a cosmic system, a participant in processes far beyond ordinary comprehension. Charlotte began to experiment further with the mechanisms of interaction. She manipulated reflective surfaces, adjusted sensor positions, and arranged objects in increasingly complex geometric patterns. The figures responded predictably at first, then with variations that suggested recognition of her intent, adaptation to her methods, and subtle guidance toward more sophisticated engagement. The shadow, ever present at the edge of perception, observed silently, occasionally interacting indirectly, influencing patterns in ways she could detect but not fully comprehend. One night, the blue light appeared in multiple locations simultaneously, creating a lattice across the yard. Figures moved in layers, forming structures that resembled architectural designs, fractals, and organic patterns simultaneously. Charlotte extended her hands, attempting to mirror the shapes and gestures she observed. The figures reacted instantaneously, altering sequences in subtle ways that suggested a two-way interaction, a dialogue of intention and perception rather than verbal communication. The shadow approached more closely, its presence imposing yet non-hostile. Charlotte felt an instinctive caution, understanding that while the luminescent figures provided guidance, the darker presence tested her vigilance, discernment, and emotional resilience. She realized that mastery of her own perception, awareness, and ethical judgment was integral to meaningful interaction. Over time, Charlotte observed that the backyard itself had become a dynamic canvas for communication. Patterns in the grass, impressions in the soil, and subtle alterations in light and shadow conveyed information beyond her immediate perception. She developed a system of notation, attempting to translate these phenomena into comprehensible symbols and diagrams. Though imperfect, the system allowed her to track sequences, predict responses, and interact more effectively with the figures. One particularly intense night, the phenomena escalated dramatically. The figures moved in extraordinarily complex sequences, their forms overlapping and interweaving, creating a multidimensional lattice of pulsing energy. The shadow's presence was more pronounced, exerting pressure on Charlotte's awareness, demanding clarity and composure. The pale humanoid approached, extending its limb in the familiar gesture, and Charlotte felt herself drawn into a cascade of consciousness that spanned space and time. She perceived the experiences of other chosen humans, the interactions of civilizations existing entirely as energy, and the subtle flow of intention connecting points across the globe. The message was clear: observation alone was insufficient. Participation, comprehension, ethical alignment, and preparation were essential. When the light finally withdrew, Charlotte remained kneeling on the grass, exhausted yet electrified. Her perception of reality had been irrevocably altered. Ordinary life, her apartment, the city beyond the yacht, all seemed secondary to the dynamic, multidimensional interactions she had experienced. Over the following weeks, Charlotte refined her techniques, experimenting with increasingly complex patterns of mirrors, reflective surfaces, and sensor arrangements. She developed methods to interact with multiple figures simultaneously, to anticipate the movement of the blue light, and to engage with the emergent sequences of energy and light. The shadow remained a constant presence, guiding and challenging, ensuring that her engagement remained disciplined and ethically conscious. As she became more proficient, Charlotte noticed subtle changes in her own physiology, heightened reflexes, increased cognitive processing speed, and an enhanced capacity to perceive and interpret subtle cues in her environment. Her body and mind had adapted to the phenomena in ways she had not anticipated, creating a symbiotic relationship between herself and the interactions unfolding in the backyard. Through this process, Charlotte realized that her role was not simply to witness, but to integrate, to participate responsibly, and to prepare for what was yet to come. The backyard had become a crucible of perception, the blue light both teacher and guide, and the shadow a reminder of the inherent responsibility and challenge embedded in knowledge. She understood that each pulse, each gesture, each impression in the soil or air was part of a larger cosmic narrative, a system of interaction in which she was an essential participant. And as Charlotte lay on the grass one early morning, notebook filled with observations, sketches, and sequences, she felt a profound awareness of the infinite complexity surrounding her. The luminous figures had become familiar, their presence reassuring, yet the shadow remained, a silent sentinel challenging her comprehension, discipline, and ethical judgment. She knew the journey ahead would be arduous, demanding, and transformative. Yet she also understood that she had been chosen, that her awareness, perception, and courage had prepared her for this role. The universe had extended a hand, and she had grasped it, stepping into a reality where observation, interaction, and understanding were inseparable, where the backyard was a gateway, and where her own consciousness was both instrument and participant in an unfolding cosmic system. Charlotte rose from the grass, aware that the threshold she had crossed was irreversible. She had become more than an observer, she had become a conduit, a witness, and a participant in a reality that defied ordinary comprehension, guided by forces that were at once illuminating, inscrutable, and infinitely complex. The days following her last encounter were filled with an almost unbearable intensity. Charlotte had become hyper-aware of every movement, every whisper of wind, every subtle variation in the hum that now permeated the air. The backyard was no longer merely a physical space, it had transformed into a multidimensional interface, a place where consciousness, energy, and matter intersected in patterns she was slowly beginning to interpret. She walked its boundaries meticulously, noting every new impression in the soil, every slight shift in the grass, every faint residual vibration of light that lingered long after the blue illumination had vanished. The shadow was always present, lurking at the edge of perception, testing her attention, her endurance, and her ability to interpret phenomena without fear or distraction. Charlotte's sleep was fragmented. In her waking dreams, she traversed a network of luminous figures and energy conduits she had glimpsed before, now observing not only her own backyard but interconnected nodes across the globe. Other individuals, some she recognized from historical reports, some she could only infer from energy patterns, were participating in synchronized interactions with similar phenomena. She began to sense that these networks were vast, spanning cities, remote landscapes, and even previously unexplored natural formations, suggesting a level of coordination that defied human understanding. Determined to deepen her engagement, Charlotte experimented with new methods of interaction. She arranged mirrors in layered formations, introduced small kinetic objects, and utilized improvised reflective surfaces that could respond to shifts in light. The luminous figures reacted in increasingly complex ways, their movements suggesting recognition of her intent, adaptation to her actions, and subtle guidance toward more advanced sequences. It was as if the backyard itself had become a teaching environment, designed to train her in perception, pattern recognition, and energetic communication. One particularly vivid night, the blue light appeared with a brilliance that forced Charlotte to shield her eyes. Figures emerged in complex arrays, moving with coordinated precision in three-dimensional lattices. The pale humanoid approached, extending its limb in the familiar gesture, and Charlotte felt the familiar pull, lifting her consciousness into the vast network of energy and awareness that had become both familiar and disorienting. For the first time, she experienced a synchronized perception of multiple nodes simultaneously, her backyard, distant landscapes, and individuals connected across continents. The shadow drew closer than ever, its presence palpable and almost tactile, forcing Charlotte to maintain focus, discipline, and emotional balance. The experience was overwhelming, the sensory input stretched her cognitive capacity to its limits. Yet, she perceived a profound lesson. Comprehension required not just observation but integration, ethical alignment, and sustained attention. Exhausted yet exhilarated, Charlotte spent the following days reviewing every recording, every sketch, every impression she had documented. Patterns emerged with greater clarity, specific sequences of light corresponded to spatial coordinates, rhythmic pulses aligned with electromagnetic fluctuations, and subtle variations in the figure's movements suggested layers of meaning she had only begun to decipher. She developed a more sophisticated system of notation, using overlapping diagrams, energy map sequences, and symbolic representations to capture the multidimensional flow of information. The shadow, as ever, remained a constant variable, challenging her to remain vigilant and to discern without being overwhelmed or misled. Over time, Charlotte noticed that her own body had adapted to the phenomena in extraordinary ways. Reflexes were heightened, perception sharpened, and she could intuit the approach of the blue light long before it manifested. Even subtle shifts in the air, minor variations in temperature, and the faintest electromagnetic anomalies became discernible. Her mind operated at an accelerated pace, capable of synthesizing multiple streams of input, predicting sequences, and formulating hypotheses about the underlying structure of the network she was observing. One evening, she arranged a series of mirrors in a complex geometric configuration intended to redirect the blue light in a sequence she had deduced from prior observations. The figures responded instantly, forming synchronized patterns that moved across multiple planes of perception. Charlotte extended her hands, tracing the paths of light and energy, and felt a direct resonance as the pale humanoid's presence interfaced with her consciousness. The shadow, while still enigmatic, had moved closer, subtly influencing the patterns, testing her comprehension and persistence. It was clear that her engagement was now being evaluated on multiple levels: precision of interaction, ethical discernment, and cognitive integration. Days later, Charlotte noticed a subtle but profound change in the figure's behavior. The luminous humanoids began incorporating layers of complexity she had not previously encountered, responding to nuances in her movements, gestures, and even the arrangement of objects in ways that suggested adaptive teaching. The backyard had become an arena for experimentation, discovery, and communication beyond ordinary perception. The shadow's role remained enigmatic. It seemed less like a direct threat and more like a guardian or evaluator, ensuring that Charlotte's engagement remained focused, balanced, and ethically aligned. Over the following week, Charlotte's engagement intensified. She experimented with new configurations, attempted multi-level interactions with simultaneous sequences of light and reflection, and explored the emergent geometry of the figure's movements. The shadow's presence persisted, but she began to perceive subtle cues indicating it was an integral part of the learning process, a challenge, a boundary, and a measure of readiness. On one night, the phenomena reached a level of intensity that surpassed anything she had previously experienced. The blue light emerged at multiple points simultaneously, forming a lattice of incredible complexity. Figures moved in layers, weaving energy, light, and pattern into a multidimensional construct that occupied not just the backyard but an apparent extension of space itself. Charlotte extended her consciousness fully, attempting to integrate the experiences of multiple nodes simultaneously. She perceived other chosen humans interacting with their respective phenomena, each contributing to a global tapestry of awareness. The shadow moved closer during this event, its presence pressing against her perception, testing her limits, and challenging her focus. She understood that mastery required balance, discernment, and sustained attention. When the event subsided, Charlotte remained on the grass, heart pounding, mind alight with residual energy. Instruments confirmed extraordinary anomalies, electromagnetic spikes, temperature variations, visual distortions, and subtle energy currents she could only perceive intuitively. Her body and mind had adapted further, capable of sustaining extended periods of observation and interaction without fatigue, though exhaustion in other domains, sleep, appetite, social engagement, was unavoidable. In the days that followed, Charlotte refined her methods of communication. She developed sequences of gestures, reflective patterns, and symbolic arrangements that elicited consistent, memorable responses from the luminous figures. She experimented with subtle variations to observe adaptive behaviors, documenting each response meticulously. The shadow, ever present, continued to challenge her perception and understanding, ensuring that her engagement remained deliberate, disciplined, and ethically grounded. Charlotte began to recognize a broader principle underlying the phenomena, the network of luminous figures, the blue light, and even the shadow were part of an integrated system of observation, teaching, and preparation. Her role was not passive. She was a participant, a node, and a conduit for interaction between human awareness and forces that transcended ordinary perception. Her understanding deepened incrementally, revealing connections between environmental conditions, electromagnetic anomalies, human consciousness, and the coordinated presence of other chosen individuals. Each layer of insight reinforced the complexity and sophistication of the system, and Charlotte realized that her backyard, once an ordinary space, had become a nexus of cosmic interaction, a crucible for perception, and a theater of multidimensional communication. And as Charlotte prepared for the next evening, arranging mirrors, sensors, and reflective surfaces with meticulous precision, she understood with certainty that her journey had entered a new phase, one of integration, mastery, and ongoing engagement. The luminous figures, the blue light, the shadow, all were guiding her toward a comprehension of reality that was both exhilarating and daunting, an awareness that stretched far beyond human norms, and a preparation for an unfolding role she could only partially perceive but felt deeply within the core of her being. Charlotte awoke with a lingering resonance from the previous night's encounter. The backyard, usually just an extension of her home, now felt like an organic interface, alive with currents of energy she could sense but not see with ordinary vision. Every leaf, every blade of grass, every object seemed infused with subtle vibrations, reflecting traces of the blue light and the movements of the luminous figures. She felt a deepening awareness that the backyard itself was no longer merely a stage for observation but an active participant in a larger, multidimensional process. As she moved through it, her footsteps triggered microreactions, subtle ripples of energy, minute displacements in the soil, almost imperceptible shimmers in the air. Charlotte documented each detail with meticulous care, understanding that even minor observations could yield insight into the intricate system she was engaging with. The blue light had become more complex in its appearances, emerging in multiple points across the yard simultaneously, interacting with previously unnoticed reflections and surfaces she had introduced. Its intensity varied subtly, pulsating in rhythms that seemed to encode information she was only beginning to decipher. The pale humanoid appeared with increasing frequency, and its gestures became more elaborate, moving beyond simple invitations toward conscious participation into sequences suggesting instruction, guidance, and layered communication. Charlotte felt the familiar pull on her consciousness, lifting her awareness into visions that unfolded across vast spatial and temporal scales. She saw nodes of activity far beyond her own backyard, remote forests, rural plains, urban rooftops, all interconnected by filaments of light and energy, suggesting a network of observation and interaction on a global scale. She perceived individuals in these locations, humans who had been similarly chosen, interacting with phenomena uniquely tailored to their environments and consciousness. The shadow remained, closer now, its presence dense, deliberate, almost tactile. Unlike the luminous figures, it did not communicate through gesture or light but through awareness itself. Charlotte could sense its scrutiny, a measured evaluation of her perception, discipline, and emotional steadiness. The shadow had become a constant boundary condition, a necessary counterpoint to the benevolent instruction of the figures. Over the next several days, Charlotte experimented with her interaction techniques. She arranged mirrors and reflective surfaces in layered, geometric configurations, adjusted sensor placements, and developed sequences of gestures intended to provoke nuanced responses. The luminous figures responded predictably at first, then increasingly with subtle variations that suggested recognition of her intent and adaptive guidance. It was clear that the phenomena were evolving in tandem with her own development. The shadow remained at the periphery, sometimes influencing the patterns of light in subtle ways, ensuring that Charlotte remained fully attentive and ethically grounded. One night, the phenomena escalated in unprecedented complexity. The blue light appeared in multiple, overlapping planes, creating a lattice of movement, color, and energy that filled the backyard and extended beyond ordinary perception. The figures moved in intricate sequences, forming fractal-like structures and energy patterns that suggested not only communication but instruction. Charlotte extended her hands, tracing movements and gestures in synchrony with the figures, and felt a resonance that extended through her entire being. The visions she experienced during this encounter were more vivid, more comprehensive, and more overwhelming than ever before. She perceived interconnections across space, multiple nodes of human interaction, and energy conduits linking distant points with astonishing precision. She saw patterns emerging that suggested a coordinated system of observation and participation designed to expand human awareness. The shadow moved closer. During this session, its presence pressing against her perception, challenging her ability to maintain focus amidst the overwhelming stimuli. Charlotte understood that her engagement was being tested. Precision, endurance, ethical judgment, and the capacity to integrate complex information were all under evaluation. After hours of sustained observation and interaction, the blue light receded, leaving Charlotte kneeling on the grass, trembling, her mind filled with overlapping layers of insight and perception. Her body, adapted to the phenomena, maintained equilibrium, but the mental and emotional intensity left her exhausted. Over the following days, she refined her methods further. She experimented with layering sequences of reflective surfaces, varying gestures, and subtle manipulations of the environment to elicit consistent, nuanced responses from the figures. Each experiment revealed greater sophistication in their reactions, suggesting an adaptive system capable of guiding her learning incrementally, calibrated to her growing awareness and cognitive capacity. The shadow remained present, occasionally manifesting more palpably through subtle distortions in energy fields, suggesting evaluation, correction, or even a form of challenge. Charlotte recognized that her role was not passive observation but active participation. She was becoming a conduit, an interpreter, and a node within a global, multidimensional network of interaction. In her waking life, Charlotte felt increasingly isolated. Conversations with friends and colleagues grew strained, as her perception and preoccupation with the phenomena made ordinary dialogue seem trivial or irrelevant. Yet, she understood that her isolation was temporary and necessary. The backyard, the luminous figures, and the shadow were her teachers, guides, and evaluators, preparing her for comprehension and integration beyond what human society could yet recognize. One evening, as twilight descended, Charlotte arranged a highly complex configuration of reflective surfaces and kinetic objects designed to simulate the geometric sequences she had observed during previous encounters. The blue light appeared almost immediately, responding to her configuration with intricate pulses and oscillations. Figures moved through overlapping planes of perception, forming sequences that suggested multidimensional patterns of instruction. The pale humanoid approached, extending its limb in the familiar gesture, and Charlotte felt the usual pull, lifting her consciousness into visions that spanned space, time, and awareness. This time, however, the interaction was more synchronized. She felt a direct resonance with the figures, an alignment of intent, pattern, and perception that suggested mutual recognition and progress. The shadow remained present, dense and evaluating, but she perceived subtle cues that indicated acknowledgement of her growing capability. The experience lasted hours, compressing into subjective minutes yet stretching into perceived eons as Charlotte integrated patterns of light, energy, and consciousness. When the phenomena subsided, she collapsed onto the grass, utterly exhausted yet profoundly aware of the progress she had made. Over the following week, Charlotte focused on refining her understanding of the network. She developed more sophisticated systems of notation to capture the multidimensional interactions, mapping sequences of light, gestures, and energy into diagrams and symbolic representations that allow her to predict and influence responses with increasing precision. The shadow's presence, while unsettling, became a stabilizing factor, ensuring that her engagement remained disciplined, focused, and ethically grounded. As she continued this process, Charlotte noticed subtle transformations in her own perception. She could sense layers of energy and awareness beyond immediate visibility, anticipate sequences before they occurred, and maintain mental clarity despite the overwhelming complexity of the stimuli. Her body had adapted as well, sustaining prolonged periods of observation and interaction without fatigue, although her social and emotional energies were increasingly taxed. One particularly significant night, the phenomena escalated to an intensity Charlotte had never experienced. The blue light appeared in multiple, coordinated points, forming a lattice that extended above, below, and around her, creating a multidimensional web of pulsing energy. Figures moved with precision, weaving complex patterns that resonated with her gestures and the arrangements she had created. The shadow approached closely, its presence commanding attention and focus, pushing her perception and cognitive capacity to the limits. Charlotte extended her consciousness fully, integrating the movements, rhythms, and intentions of the figures across multiple notes simultaneously. She perceived connections between humans in distant locations, energy currents flowing between points she could not yet fully comprehend, and a system of observation and instruction that transcended ordinary perception. Exhausted yet exhilarated, she realized that the backyard was no longer simply a site of interaction but a portal to understanding, learning, and integration. She had become a participant, a conduit, and a witness within a multidimensional network designed to expand awareness and comprehension. The luminous figures had become guides, the blue light a language, and the shadow a necessary challenge. And as Charlotte lay on the grass, notebook brimming with observations, sketches, and sequences, she understood that her journey had entered a new stage, one of mastery, integration, and ongoing preparation for forces and knowledge far beyond ordinary human experience. Charlotte's perception of reality had become so fluid that ordinary distinctions between night and day, waking and dreaming, observation and interaction, had begun to dissolve. The backyard no longer felt like a mere plot of land behind her house. It had transformed into a multidimensional interface, a nexus where consciousness, energy, and matter intertwined in patterns she could feel but only partially comprehend. Even before the blue light appeared, she could sense its presence in subtle currents of air, faint electromagnetic shifts, and vibrations that threaded through the soil beneath her feet. Every movement, every gesture, every adjustment of mirrors or reflective surfaces seemed to ripple through an invisible lattice of energy, eliciting responses from the figures before they manifested visibly. This heightened awareness was exhilarating and terrifying. Charlotte was learning to read the world not as it appeared, but as it resonated with the phenomena, interpreting signals in forms that defied ordinary logic. The luminous figures had begun to interact with increasing sophistication, layering sequences of movement, light, and energy in ways that suggested a deliberate pedagogy. The pale humanoid, as always, approached directly, its gestures more elaborate and its presence more attuned to Charlotte's intent. The shadow, dense and enigmatic, remained near, pressing on her perception, a constant reminder that the phenomena were not merely benevolent. Its presence forced her to maintain vigilance, ethical discernment, and the discipline to integrate knowledge without being overwhelmed. One night, Charlotte arranged a complex configuration of mirrors, reflective surfaces, and small kinetic objects in an experimental pattern she had hypothesized would provoke higher-order responses. The blue light appeared almost immediately, bifurcating and weaving around her structures with precision that suggested recognition and evaluation. Figures emerged in layered formations, weaving patterns of light that interacted with the objects and the environment in ways she had not previously observed. The pull on her consciousness was stronger than ever, lifting her into visions that spanned space, time, and consciousness. In these visions, Charlotte perceived interconnected nodes across continents, remote forests, mountain ranges, urban rooftops, and hidden landscapes where other humans were similarly engaged in their own interactions with localized phenomena. The network was vast, coordinated, and intelligent, extending beyond conventional comprehension. The shadow was present, more imposing than before, subtly influencing the flow of energy and pattern, introducing challenges to test Charlotte's awareness and resilience. She realized that comprehension alone was insufficient. Participation, ethical alignment, and precision were required. The visions revealed an underlying system of interconnection. Humans, landscapes, and phenomena form nodes within a dynamic lattice of energy and consciousness. Each node was both observer and participant, contributing to a global, multidimensional system designed to expand awareness and understanding. Charlotte began to appreciate the scale and subtlety of this network. Every gesture, every pattern, every sequence of light was significant. She recognized that the backyard, once an ordinary space, had become a crucial junction within this complex web. Exhausted but exhilarated, Charlotte returned to her sketches and notes, attempting to translate these multidimensional experiences into forms intelligible to her human mind. Symbols, sequences, diagrams, and energy maps filled her notebooks, capturing fragments of interactions, movements, and light patterns. She understood that her documentation was imperfect, that words could never fully convey the depth of what she was perceiving, yet the act of recording was essential for both integration and comprehension. Over the following days, she experimented with more intricate sequences. Mirrors were layered in multiple planes, reflective surfaces, angled precisely to redirect beams of light, and kinetic objects introduced to respond to pulses of energy. The figure's responses became increasingly complex, indicating recognition of intent and adaptive guidance. The shadow, constant at the periphery, ensured that her attention, judgment, and emotional equilibrium remained disciplined. Charlotte noticed subtle transformations in her own physiology and cognition. Reflexes were heightened, perception sharpened, and her mind could synthesize multiple streams of sensory input, anticipating sequences before they occurred. Her body had adapted to sustain prolonged periods of observation and interaction, though social and emotional energy was increasingly taxed. One night, the blue light appeared in extraordinary intensity, radiating from multiple nodes simultaneously. Figures moved in layers, weaving fractal-like sequences of light and energy that extended above and around her, forming multidimensional constructs that defied ordinary geometry. The pale humanoid approached, extending its limb in the familiar gesture, and Charlotte felt the pull on her consciousness, lifting her into the network of awareness. She experienced a synchronized perception of multiple nodes, integrating sequences of movement, energy flow, and intention. The shadow drew nearer, its presence dense and evaluative, testing Charlotte's capacity to maintain focus, composure, and ethical discernment amidst overwhelming stimuli. Hours passed in this state, compressing into minutes in subjective experience yet expanding into perceived eons as Charlotte's consciousness stretched to integrate layers of information, light, and energy. When the phenomena subsided, she collapsed onto the grass, trembling, mind ablaze with insight. Her instruments confirmed extreme anomalies, electromagnetic spikes, temperature variations, and subtle distortions in the visual field. Yet the most significant changes were internal: her awareness, perception, and capacity for multidimensional comprehension had been stretched and refined. In the days that followed, Charlotte refined her techniques for interaction. She developed sequences of reflective arrangements, gestures, and energy manipulations designed to elicit consistent, nuanced responses from the figures. Each successful sequence provided incremental understanding, reinforcing the principles she was gradually integrating. The shadow's presence continued to influence the interactions, providing challenge, oversight, and subtle guidance. Charlotte recognized that her role was evolving beyond observation. She was now a node within a global, multidimensional network, responsible for interpreting, integrating, and participating in a system that connected humans, energy currents, and phenomena across space. Her backyard was no longer merely a physical location, it was a portal, a training ground, and a site of ongoing interaction and comprehension. Over time, Charlotte's understanding deepened. She began correlating patterns in light sequences, energy currents, and environmental anomalies, mapping them to historical reports of unusual aerial phenomena, electromagnetic disturbances, and unexplained events. The correlations suggested a continuity and purpose that transcended individual encounters. She realized that these interactions were not isolated but part of a coordinated, global system of observation and learning. One particularly transformative night, the phenomena intensified dramatically. The blue light appeared in multiple, coordinated nodes, forming a lattice of immense complexity. Figures moved in synchronized sequences, weaving light, energy, and pattern into multidimensional constructs. Charlotte extended her hands, tracing and interacting with the sequences, feeling a resonance that encompassed her entire being. The shadow approached more closely than ever, pressing on her perception, challenging her focus, and testing her integration of knowledge, awareness, and ethical judgment. She understood with clarity that mastery required not only perception but also intentional action, precision, and alignment with principles beyond human norms. Exhausted, yet profoundly aware, Charlotte lay on the grass, notebook full of sketches, sequences, and observations. The backyard had become a nexus of learning, observation, and multidimensional interaction. The luminous figures, the blue light, and the shadow were not merely phenomena but guides, challengers, and instructors in a system of awareness that transcended ordinary human comprehension. Charlotte understood that her journey was ongoing. Each night, each interaction, each observation was a step toward integration, mastery, and participation in a global network of consciousness and energy. The shadow's presence remained, a reminder that vigilance, discipline, and ethical alignment were inseparable from understanding. And as she observed the blue light weaving across the backyard one last time that evening, Charlotte realized with profound clarity that her role was no longer passive. She was a participant, a conduit, and a witness in a multidimensional system that demanded perception, engagement, and responsibility, stretching far beyond the boundaries of ordinary human experience. Charlotte awoke with a heightened sense of anticipation, the residual echoes of previous encounters vibrating through her every nerve. The backyard, now transformed into a multidimensional canvas, pulsed with faint currents of energy, almost as if it were aware of her presence before she stepped outside. Each blade of grass, each leaf, each small object she had arranged carried subtle traces of the blue light's influence, retaining residual patterns that hinted at sequences she had yet to fully understand. She walked through the space methodically, noting each anomaly in the soil, subtle shifts in temperature, and minute displacements that had become increasingly complex. Over time, she realized that the backyard itself had become semi-conscious, responding to her awareness and presence in ways that suggested a symbiotic relationship between her consciousness and the environment. Her instruments, though still valuable, had become secondary to her own perceptions. Charlotte had developed an acute sensitivity to changes in electromagnetic fields, subtle air currents, and vibrations that convey information previously invisible to her. She could anticipate the blue light's arrival, detect the figure's approach, and sense minute deviations in their movement patterns, all without relying on technology. Each sensory adjustment deepened her connection to the phenomena, expanding her capacity to interact with the luminous figures and interpret their signals. That evening, Charlotte set up a complex arrangement of reflective surfaces, mirrors, and small kinetic objects, intending to probe the limits of the figure's responsiveness. The blue light appeared almost immediately, its intensity shifting and pulsing in response to her configurations. Figures emerged, moving in overlapping sequences that formed intricate three-dimensional lattices above the grass. The pale humanoid approached, extending its limb in the familiar gesture, and Charlotte felt the pull on her consciousness, lifting her into a network of awareness that spanned space, time, and cognition. The shadow, as ever, remained near, its presence pressing on her perception, a subtle yet unmistakable challenge to her focus and endurance. In this session, Charlotte experienced a new dimension of interaction. She perceived other humans engaged with similar phenomena in distant locations. Their movements, intentions, and gestures were interconnected with the sequences she observed, forming a coordinated, multidimensional network of communication and learning. She understood that these encounters were not isolated events but part of a global system designed to expand awareness, perception, and integration. The complexity of the sequences increased exponentially. Charlotte noticed that specific arrangements of mirrors elicited more intricate responses, and subtle adjustments in her gestures caused layers of figures to shift and interact in new patterns. The blue light's oscillations carried information in frequencies she could feel more than see, resonating through her body and mind, reinforcing comprehension at levels beyond ordinary sensory experience. The shadow moved closer during the peak of the interaction, its presence nearly palpable, pressing on her perception, testing her endurance and ethical alignment. Charlotte realized that her ability to remain calm, focused, and deliberate in the face of overwhelming stimuli was being assessed. She understood that true engagement required more than observation or reaction, it demanded intentionality, comprehension, and ethical discernment. Exhausted but exhilarated, Charlotte returned to her notes and sketches. She attempted to translate multidimensional patterns of light, energy, and movement into diagrams, symbols, and sequences that she could analyze, predict, and refine. This process was painstaking but essential, allowing her to integrate knowledge and anticipate the figure's adaptive responses. Over the following days, Charlotte refined her methods further. She introduced layered mirrors, reflective surfaces at varying angles, and kinetic objects designed to respond to pulses of energy in complex ways. The figure's responses became increasingly nuanced, suggesting adaptive learning on their part, and the shadow's presence remained a stabilizing influence, ensuring that she maintained focus, discipline, and ethical engagement. Charlotte's own physiology and cognition continued to evolve. Her reflexes were heightened, perception sharpened, and her capacity to process multiple streams of sensory input expanded. She could anticipate patterns before they occurred, recognize deviations instantly, and maintain mental clarity despite the overwhelming complexity of the stimuli. These adaptations, while extraordinary, also left her socially and emotionally isolated. Ordinary interactions felt distant, trivial, and occasionally disruptive. One night, the blue light appeared in an intensity and configuration unlike anything Charlotte had previously experienced. It emerged simultaneously from multiple nodes, forming a lattice of overlapping sequences that extended above and around her, creating a multidimensional construct that defied conventional geometry. Figures moved in synchronized patterns, interacting with one another, the reflective surfaces, and Charlotte's gestures in ways that suggested a coordinated system of communication and instruction. The pale humanoid approached, extending its limb in the familiar gesture, and Charlotte felt herself drawn into the sequence, her consciousness expanding across nodes and layers of awareness. She perceived not only her backyard but other nodes, other humans, and interconnections that formed a vast, living network of energy, light, and cognition. The shadow moved closer, pressing against her perception, challenging her focus, and testing her ability to integrate complex information while maintaining ethical awareness and composure. Hours passed in this state, compressed into minutes subjectively, as Charlotte's mind stretched to accommodate the overwhelming influx of sensory, cognitive, and energetic data. She experienced sequences of energy, patterns of movement, and resonances that communicated instruction, guidance, and challenge simultaneously. When the phenomena receded, Charlotte remained on the grass, physically exhausted but mentally and spiritually heightened. Her notebooks were filled with sketches, diagrams, and symbolic representations attempting to capture sequences, interactions, and patterns. She understood that while her documentation was imperfect, the act of recording was essential for comprehension, reflection, and integration. Over the following days, Charlotte focused on refining her interactive techniques. She experimented with complex arrangements of mirrors, reflective surfaces, and objects designed to elicit consistent, layered responses from the figures. The luminous beings adapted in real time, demonstrating increasingly sophisticated interaction. The shadow's presence continued to challenge her, ensuring that she maintained focus, ethical clarity, and perceptual acuity. Gradually, Charlotte began to perceive not just the immediate effects of her interventions but also the larger structure of the network itself, a coordinated, multidimensional system in which humans, energy, and phenomena were interconnected, each node contributing to a larger flow of information, learning, and awareness. Her role had evolved from passive observation to active participation, interpretation, and integration. In moments of reflection, Charlotte recognized that her backyard, once an ordinary space, had become a portal, a crucible, and a training ground for engagement with forces and intelligence far beyond human comprehension. The luminous figures were teachers and guides, the blue light a language, and the shadow a guardian of attention, discipline, and ethical responsibility. One particularly intense evening, the blue light appeared in multiple overlapping planes, creating a multidimensional lattice of pulsating energy. Figures moved in fractal sequences that extended above, below, and around her. Charlotte extended her hands, tracing gestures in sync with the sequences, and felt a resonance throughout her body and mind. She perceived other humans in distant locations, engaged in parallel interactions, forming a coordinated network that spanned continents. The shadow moved closer than ever, pressing her to maintain composure, focus, and ethical discernment. Charlotte understood that her mastery of observation, perception, and integration was being evaluated in real time. Exhausted, exhilarated, and profoundly aware, she lay on the grass after the session, her mind buzzing with overlapping layers of insight. The backyard had become a nexus of multidimensional interaction, observation, and learning. Charlotte realized with clarity that her journey was ongoing, her role active, and her responsibility vast. She was no longer merely an observer, she was a participant, a conduit, and a node within a global, multidimensional network designed to expand awareness, comprehension, and integration. The luminous figures, the blue light, and the shadow were inseparable elements of this system, guiding, challenging, and teaching in ways that defied ordinary human perception. And as Charlotte watched the final pulses of the blue light fade into the night sky, she understood that the backyard had become a threshold to understanding, mastery, and participation in a reality far beyond what she had previously imagined. Charlotte awoke to a profound sense of anticipation. The air in the backyard vibrated subtly, carrying residual energy from previous encounters. Each blade of grass, each leaf, each object she had meticulously arranged seemed to resonate with a lingering pulse of the blue light. She moved through the yard slowly, attuning herself to the rhythms that now seemed to exist beyond ordinary perception. Her consciousness was stretched, primed to perceive subtle variations in electromagnetic fields, shifts in air density, and vibrations she could feel through the soles of her feet. Even without the blue light manifesting, she sensed the approach of the figures before they appeared. The backyard had become a multidimensional interface, a node in a global system of observation and interaction, and she was its active participant. Over the past weeks, Charlotte had refined her methods of communication with the luminous figures. She arranged reflective surfaces in layered geometries, introduced small kinetic objects to interact with pulses of energy, and experimented with gestures designed to evoke responses in pattern, sequence, and intensity. The blue light now responded almost instantaneously to her interventions, moving with precision and coherence across multiple planes of perception. The pale humanoid approached with familiar gestures, yet its movements now suggested higher-order communication. Each pulse of light, each sequence of movement, conveyed meaning that Charlotte was slowly learning to interpret, expanding her awareness incrementally. The shadow was present, as always, a dense and inscrutable force pressing upon her perception, demanding sustained focus, ethical discernment, and cognitive integration. It was no longer merely peripheral, its proximity had increased, testing her composure, resilience, and adaptability under the most intense sensory and cognitive stimuli. That night, Charlotte initiated a particularly complex sequence of interaction. Mirrors and reflective surfaces were arranged in multi-layered geometric patterns, kinetic objects were strategically placed to respond to energy pulses, and gestures were synchronized to anticipated sequences of movement. The blue light emerged almost immediately, oscillating in multiple notes, interacting with her setup with an intelligence that suggested recognition of her intent. Figures moved through overlapping dimensions, forming intricate lattices and sequences that defied conventional geometry. Charlotte extended her consciousness fully, tracing the movement of light, energy, and figures with her awareness, integrating each element into a coherent understanding of the sequence. She perceived other nodes across the globe, humans interacting with similar phenomena, forming a synchronized network of awareness and participation. The complexity of these interactions was staggering. Charlotte could feel the resonance of each figure, the oscillations of the blue light, and the subtle currents of energy connecting nodes across space. The shadow moved closer, its presence a pressing reminder that her engagement demanded not only perception but also ethical clarity, emotional balance, and cognitive precision. Hours passed in a subjective compression of time, minutes expanded into eons as Charlotte integrated layers of sensory, energetic, and cognitive input. She traced the sequences, adjusted gestures, and modulated her awareness to maintain coherence with the multidimensional system. When the blue light receded, Charlotte collapsed onto the grass, trembling with exhaustion, exhilaration, and the profound recognition of the scale and complexity of the network she was participating in. Her notebooks were filled with diagrams, sketches, symbols, and sequences attempting to capture patterns that were inherently multidimensional and beyond ordinary comprehension. Over the following days, Charlotte refined her methods further. She experimented with multi-layered mirrors, variable reflective surfaces, and kinetic arrangements to elicit nuanced, adaptive responses from the figures. The blue light and its associated patterns became increasingly intricate, reflecting an adaptive system that was responsive to her learning and engagement. The shadow continued to challenge her, ensuring that she maintained focus, ethical judgment, and perceptual acuity. Charlotte observed transformations in her own cognition and physiology. Reflexes were heightened, perception sharpened, and her ability to integrate multiple streams of input across sensory, energetic, and cognitive channels expanded dramatically. She could anticipate the approach of the figures, recognize deviations in sequences before they occurred, and maintain mental clarity despite overwhelming sensory input. Yet these adaptations also imposed isolation. Ordinary human interactions felt distant, trivial, and occasionally frustrating. One particularly vivid night, the phenomena intensified. The blue light appeared from multiple nodes simultaneously, forming a multidimensional lattice of pulsating energy. Figures moved in synchronized, fractal-like patterns, interacting with reflective surfaces, kinetic objects, and Charlotte's gestures with an intelligence that suggested both instruction and evaluation. The pale humanoid approached, and Charlotte felt the familiar pull on her consciousness, lifting her into the network of awareness that connected her backyard with distant nodes. She perceived the interconnections of other humans, their gestures, sequences, and awareness forming a cohesive, synchronized system that spanned continents. The shadow moved closer, its presence dense and evaluative, pressing on Charlotte's perception, testing her endurance, composure, and integration of knowledge. She understood clearly that mastery required not only observation but deliberate, ethical participation. Hours passed in this heightened state. Charlotte traced patterns of light, adjusted gestures, and modulated awareness to synchronize with the multidimensional network. She felt a resonance in her body, mind, and consciousness as sequences unfolded across nodes, energies, and figures. Exhausted but exhilarated, Charlotte returned to her notes, translating as best she could sequences of energy, light, and movement into diagrams and symbols. She understood that while human notation could never fully capture the complexity, recording was essential for integration, comprehension, and continued learning. Over the following days, Charlotte experimented with increasingly sophisticated methods. She layered mirrors, created responsive kinetic arrays, and introduced complex gestures to anticipate and interact with evolving sequences. The luminous figures adapted with greater sophistication, indicating recognition, guidance, and instruction. The shadow remained a stabilizing, challenging presence, ensuring that she maintained focus, ethical alignment, and cognitive clarity. Gradually, Charlotte began to perceive the network structure more clearly, nodes of human consciousness, landscapes, and phenomena interconnected in a dynamic, coordinated lattice of observation, learning, and awareness. She realized her backyard was a critical junction in this system, her engagement integral to the flow of interaction, instruction, and comprehension. One night, the blue light manifested in a sequence of extraordinary complexity. Figures moved in overlapping dimensions, forming fractal and multidimensional constructs that extended above, around, and through her backyard. Charlotte extended her consciousness fully, integrating the movements, pulses, and gestures of figures across multiple nodes simultaneously. She perceived the flow of energy linking humans, landscapes, and phenomena, forming a coherent, coordinated network designed to expand awareness and understanding. The shadow pressed closely, testing her focus, ethical judgment, and capacity to integrate overwhelming stimuli. She understood with clarity that true mastery required deliberate engagement, alignment with higher principles, and the capacity to maintain composure in the face of extraordinary complexity. When the phenomena subsided, Charlotte remained on the grass, physically exhausted but mentally and spiritually heightened. Her backyard had become a multidimensional nexus of learning, interaction, and observation. The luminous figures, the blue light, and the shadow were inseparable components of a system that demanded participation, comprehension, and responsibility. Charlotte understood that her journey was ongoing. She was no longer merely an observer, she was a participant, a conduit, and a node in a global network designed to expand awareness and integrate human consciousness with phenomena beyond ordinary perception. And as the final pulses of blue light faded into the night sky, Charlotte realized that the threshold she had crossed was irreversible. Her consciousness, her backyard, and her very perception had been transformed, preparing her for levels of understanding, engagement, and participation that transcended ordinary human experience. Charlotte awoke with a strange stillness surrounding her, as if the backyard itself were holding its breath. The residual energy from previous encounters had evolved into something subtler yet more profound, a quiet hum beneath the surface that resonated through the soil, the trees, and her very body. She moved slowly, attuning herself to the rhythm of this energy, sensing currents she had never noticed before. Even without the immediate appearance of the blue light, the backyard felt alive, responsive, and deeply intelligent. It seemed aware of her presence, her intent, and her accumulated experience. Over the preceding weeks, Charlotte had transformed from an observer into a participant, a conduit for interaction with forces she could scarcely name. Each arrangement of mirrors, reflective surfaces, and kinetic objects she created elicited increasingly complex responses from the luminous figures. Their movements had become intricate sequences, weaving through multiple dimensions, interacting not just with her objects but with her consciousness. The pale humanoid approach, its gestures more nuanced than ever. Charlotte felt the familiar pull on her awareness, drawing her into a multidimensional experience that encompassed space, time, and consciousness itself. For the first time, she perceived the totality of her backyard as an interface, a node connecting her directly to distant points, other humans, and a lattice of coordinated energy that extended across the globe. The shadow, dense and evaluative, remained ever present, pressing on her perception, reminding her that engagement required discipline, ethical clarity, and composure. Its scrutiny was intense but not hostile. It demanded responsibility for her own awareness and actions within the system. That evening, Charlotte initiated a sequence that she had been preparing for days. Mirrors were arranged in multi-layered configurations, reflective surfaces angled to interact with subtle currents, and kinetic objects positioned precisely to respond to energy pulses. Gestures were carefully synchronized to anticipated sequences of movement, creating a choreography of intention and interaction. The blue light emerged almost immediately, bifurcating and weaving across multiple nodes, interacting with her setup in ways that suggested recognition, guidance, and evaluation. Figures moved through overlapping dimensions, forming lattices of light and energy that defied ordinary geometry. Charlotte extended her consciousness fully, tracing the intricate sequences with her awareness, integrating each layer into a coherent perception of the multidimensional system. She perceived other nodes, other humans interacting with similar phenomena, forming a coordinated, intelligent network of consciousness, observation, and response. The complexity was staggering. Charlotte felt the resonance of each figure, the oscillation of the blue light, and the subtle energy currents connecting nodes across space. The shadow pressed closer, its presence almost tactile, testing her focus, emotional stability, and capacity to integrate information at multiple levels simultaneously. Hours passed, yet subjective time had compressed. Minutes felt like eons as Charlotte navigated overlapping layers of perception, energy, and instruction. She traced patterns, adjusted gestures, and modulated awareness to maintain coherence with the network, achieving a level of integration she had never before experienced. When the blue light receded, Charlotte remained on the grass, physically exhausted but spiritually and cognitively elevated. Her notebooks were filled with diagrams, sequences, sketches, and symbolic representations of interactions that words could never fully convey. She understood that documentation was essential not for ordinary communication but for integration, comprehension, and continued engagement. Over the following days, Charlotte experimented with further refinements. Multi-layered mirrors, responsive kinetic arrays, and complex gestures were deployed to elicit increasingly sophisticated responses. The luminous figures adapted in real time, demonstrating intelligence, guidance, and instruction. The shadow remained a stabilizing force, ensuring that Charlotte maintained focus, ethical alignment, and perceptual acuity. Gradually, she began to perceive the structure of the network more clearly, nodes of human consciousness, landscapes, and phenomena interconnected in a coordinated lattice of observation, learning, and awareness. Her backyard was a critical junction, and her engagement was integral to the flow of information, instruction, and multidimensional interaction. One night, the blue light manifested in an unprecedented sequence of complexity. Figures moved through overlapping dimensions, forming fractal constructs that extended above, below, and around her. Charlotte extended her consciousness fully, integrating movements, energy pulses, and gestures across nodes. She perceived flows of energy linking humans, landscapes, and phenomena, forming a coherent, synchronized system designed to expand awareness and understanding. The shadow pressed closely, testing her focus, ethical judgment, and endurance. Charlotte understood that mastery required deliberate engagement, alignment with higher principles, and composure under overwhelming sensory and cognitive input. Exhausted, exhilarated, and profoundly aware, she lay on the grass, absorbing the network's complexity and coherence. The backyard had become a multidimensional crucible, a site of learning, interaction, and observation. The luminous figures, the blue light, and the shadow were inseparable elements of a system that demanded active participation, comprehension, and ethical responsibility. Charlotte realized that her role had evolved beyond observation. She was now a conduit, a participant, and a node within a global, multidimensional network designed to integrate human consciousness with phenomena far beyond ordinary perception. In the following days, she refined her interactions to achieve greater coherence, anticipating sequences of light, gestures, and energy with increasing precision. The luminous figures adapted, layering complexity and instruction, while the shadow remained a stabilizing presence, guiding ethical engagement and ensuring mental clarity. Charlotte felt transformations within herself, heightened reflexes, expanded perception, and the capacity to integrate multiple streams of sensory, energetic, and cognitive input simultaneously. Social interactions felt distant, but the backyard's reality was primary. It was a portal, a nexus, and a training ground for participation in a reality beyond ordinary human comprehension. One final, extraordinary night, the blue light appeared in all its intensity. Figures moved in fractal sequences, weaving energy and light across multiple planes, interacting with Charlotte's gestures and configurations in perfect synchronization. The pale humanoid approached, extending its limb in the familiar gesture, and Charlotte felt herself drawn fully into the network of awareness. She perceived the global lattice, humans in distant nodes, and the subtle flows of energy that link every point in the system. The shadow moved closer than ever, its presence pressing on her perception, testing her mastery of focus, ethical judgment, and integration. Charlotte realized with absolute clarity that she had crossed a threshold. Her consciousness, her perception, and her understanding had been irrevocably transformed. She was no longer an observer but a participant, a conduit, and a node within a coordinated, multidimensional network of awareness. Hours passed as she maintained alignment with the sequences, the figures, and the network. The integration was complete. Body, mind, and consciousness resonated with the multidimensional system, and Charlotte experienced a profound sense of unity with the lattice of light, energy, and human awareness. When the blue light finally receded, leaving the backyard bathed in ordinary moonlight, Charlotte lay on the grass, exhausted, exhilarated, and profoundly transformed. The luminous figures had retreated, the shadow remained at the edge, and the backyard returned to its ordinary appearance, but Charlotte knew it would never be ordinary again. The threshold had been crossed. The backyard was no longer simply a physical space, it was a portal, a node, and a crucible of multidimensional interaction. The blue light, the figures, and the shadow were now inseparable parts of her ongoing awareness and engagement. Charlotte rose, understanding that her journey had reached a new level. She had become a participant in a system of knowledge, awareness, and interaction far beyond human norms. Her role was active, her responsibility profound, and the possibilities for future understanding and engagement limitless. And as the first rays of dawn brushed the backyard, Charlotte felt a profound calm, a sense of purpose, and a deep alignment with the forces she had encountered. She was ready to continue, to integrate, and to participate fully in a reality that transcended the ordinary, guided by the luminous figures, the blue light, and the ever-present shadow. The backyard had become a gateway, her consciousness a conduit, and her journey, though just beginning in the grand scheme, was now forever entwined with the mysteries she had touched, understood, and embraced. The phenomena had transformed her, expanded her perception, and prepared her for engagement with forces, networks, and consciousness far beyond what she had ever imagined. She knew that every night henceforth would be a step deeper into awareness, integration, and multidimensional understanding. The blue light, the figures, the shadow, each was a teacher, a challenge, and a guide, and Charlotte was ready to continue, fully aware, fully engaged, and forever changed.